I'm sorry, Commissioner McKissick.
Just one or two quick questions. And Mr. Williamson, this is addressed to you about this DSM-EE measures, whether 1%, 1.5% goals or target are reasonable in it. And I guess the question is simply this.
Commissioner McKissick, I hate to interrupt. We can't really hear you, sir.
Oh, really?
Yes, sir.
Is this a bit better now?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and this is addressed to Mr. Williamson, and it kind of tags along with some of the issues Commissioner Hughes was asking about. And it's looking at that 1%, 1.5% reduction in terms of a potential target. I mean, what do you see as being objectionable about a plan to perhaps phase in that kind of reduction, say over some period of time, some reasonable measured period of time, and doing it in a way where you can verify the extent of the reduction, but with a target, let's say you're looking at maybe 6 years, hypothetically, starting out at 1%, moving to 1.25%, moving to 1.5%. Because I did notice in your testimony, you say that the public staff is open to consideration of incentivizing aspirational savings targets in DSM and EE mechanisms. So maybe you can just give me your thoughts about that, if you could, sir.
So in the EE mechanism, we actually do have an additional incentive that came about. I want to say that I might have a cite in my testimony to it, but it originated out of a South Carolina settlement during the time whenever they were trying to pull together a mechanism for their DSME portfolios, and it was brought up to North Carolina to kind of create some alignment as far as what is offered. The public staff didn't take any issue with that type of target at that time. We saw it as more of the mechanism in the EE rider, as far as the Senate Bill 3, is designed to encourage energy efficiency, and we thought that was a reasonable type of incentive to try and pursue a specified target and encourage the utility to try and hit it. Now that we're a decade down the road, I know the majority of all of this proceeding is on the first section of House Bill 951, but there's a piece in the second section of 951 that gets into the multi-year rate case and how that proceeding is going to be handled. And we've already had plenty of conversations and rulings from the commission on how to handle PIMs and other aspects of that multi-year rate case. And now, prior to that language, we didn't have an establishment of a prior year retail sales target for the company or any utility to achieve by certain timelines, kind of similar to how we have swine poultry requirements in the reps compliance as far as year timeline requirements. But now that we have a system set up in the multi-year rate plan that could have something as far as a target or a percentage of sales type achievement goal or a target, and that means public staff, I don't think we would believe that would be the more appropriate forum for those types of discussions, for us to look into how that performance could be evaluated across this whole multi-year rate case and carbon plan reduction planning. And so as far as in the mechanism, I know I do state that, but I also kind of caveated that this PIMS situation could be another alternative, and that might actually be another, I guess, more appropriate now that we actually have established, path for PIMS. That might actually be a more appropriate topic consideration there.
Okay, well, that's what I was just curious about. I know you had mentioned PIMS as a potential, but you'd also had the language there about, consideration of incentivizing these aspirational savings with targets, which, so I mean, I was just interested in getting further clarity from you in terms of what your thoughts are, and I think you provided that in the interest of time, since we have a lot going on this afternoon. Chair Mitchell, that's it.
All right, Commissioner Kimmerer. Okay. I have a few for y'all. And let's see. I'm gonna start with let's go back to natural gas supply issues. So let's start sort of high level. Help me understand how gas gets into North Carolina and delivered to those power generating stations. What happens from a transactional standpoint?
So from my view, Duke Energy will need to secure the transportation across the natural gas pipeline.
And when you say natural gas pipeline, you mean the interstate pipeline?
Correct.
Okay.
And then so let's say Williams Transco, they say, all right, we want X amount of units off Williams Transco in terms of decatherms. And then they have to say, let's use Sutton as an example. They have to use Piedmont system. So that would be a transportation customer. So Duke will secure the right of way through Piedmont system and the main Transco system for that unit of volume, subscribed unit of volume to that overall plant.
Okay. And when you say right of way, you're just using that figuratively. You mean they're going to secure rights to transport a specified volume across the LDC Piedmont, in this case, is pipelines, intrastate pipeline system.
That is correct.
Okay.
That's the issues when you have someone with electrical background trying to explain natural gas.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. And so, and where does the actual gas, where do the molecules come from?
It's just based upon where it's injected. Predominantly, you have it down in the Louisiana area or off the Gulf, but then you also have the Marcellus Shale up in the Northeast. I think you've heard in other dockets sort of that pressure bubble. It's just the input to the system. I mean, you can't trace that gas molecule from that point all the way to the other point.
And that's fair. And that my question wasn't very clear. But my real question was, the gas is procured separately from the from the right to transport that gas. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Based on your understanding, recognize you're not the guy or girl that's having to enter into those transactions, but this is your understanding.
That is my understanding, that you procure the capacity, the pipeline, and then you also then procure the energy. In this case, it'll be natural gas.
Okay. And you just alluded to this, but at this point in time, on the Transco interstate pipeline, which is the only interstate pipeline that serves North Carolina at this point, correct?
Correct.
So at this point in time, molecules are entering the Transco pipeline from the Marcellus and Utica regions, as well as from down in the Gulf of Mexico area, correct?
Correct.
And maybe points elsewhere, but we'll just say for simplicity's sake, those two regions. And so the public staff for some time now and multiple dockets has expressed concern about natural gas supply. Am I right about that?
That is
Okay.
correct. And with both the electric and the gas filings.
Okay, so let's focus then on the electric filings. What, in a nutshell, what is the concern that the public staff wants the commission to be aware of?
The limitations of transportation, or the ability to provide 365-day service to incremental or new natural gas facilities and scale to that of, say, a combined cycle.
Okay. And does the public staff have concern at present about supply for the existing natural gas fired generating fleet?
The existing fleet, no, I do not have a concern.
Okay. Is it correct that certain of Duke's natural gas fired assets are co-fired, meaning they can be operated and generate electricity using other types of fuel?
Blues Creek, Marshall, and Cliffside are what they refer to as dual fuel operational. Yes, they can be co-fired.
Okay. And that would be with coal. So those facilities can operate on coal or on gas. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And then there are backup fuel supplies at certain of of Duke's natural gas fired generating facilities as well, correct?
Correct. For example, Lincoln County CT units 1 through 16 and Lincoln County 17, they have on-site fuel storage, backup fuel storage for those events that either economically or potential curtailments of the natural gas that they can switch over to fuel oil.
Okay. Okay. So do the public staff's concerns about transportation of natural gas relate only to Duke's ability to get gas into North Carolina? Or do they relate to Duke's ability to get gas or to have transportation from a point inside North Carolina to its generating stations?
There's 2 points of concern. One is just the ability to get natural gas into North Carolina, which I think addresses your first question. However, the public staff has also addressed concerns of the natural gas price in relationship to the MVP potential delivery.
Okay, okay, I think that's a different issue. But
Yes.
am I understanding you to say the public staff isn't so much concerned about Duke's ability to transport gas within the state? It's just getting gas in on an interstate asset that's the concern?
That is correct.
Okay, okay. Um, okay. We've talked some today about Transco expansion projects. And there's been muddled reference, I think, to what those specific projects are, and confirm that the public staff is aware of the expansion project that Transco has asked for approval of, which it refers to as the Southside Reliability Project.
Yes. It is my understanding that there's 2 distinct projects. One runs almost horizontal from Virginia over into Northeast North Carolina, and then the other upgrade is at Station 166 down.
In Iredell.
But yes, ma'am.
So, but it's possible that both of those projects make up the Southside Reliability Project for Transco's purposes of asking for approval from the federal government. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay.
And my review is that both of them have a common linkage, if you would, of the Station 166 upgrade. So they're both
Okay.
dependent upon that one center point on the system.
Okay. And just help me understand so that I can think through this correctly. So let's say that Transco is successful in getting whatever approvals it needs and is able to put those new compressor stations or whatever upgrades they are into service. Essentially what that does is that just creates more headroom or more capacity in its pipeline to transport more gas. Is that right?
Correct.
And is that like 24/7, 365 capacity, or is it capacity only on certain days, times, months?
Those expansion projects should be 365.
Okay, so just sort of it's in the lawyer's way of thinking, it almost just makes the pipeline bigger. Is that right?
In a simplified way, yes.
Okay. Okay. And so really gas, to the extent that that capacity in the pipeline comes available and somebody's able to buy it from Transco, the gas could come from Marcellus and Utica, or it could come from the Gulf, right? Given that Transco is now bidirectional?
In theory, yes.
Okay. Why only in theory?
Getting a little bit outside of my expertise and having to how Transco sort of has to maintain where your inputs are versus your outputs.
Okay,
And it's
fair,
in reference
fair.
to the pressure bubble.
I'll take your, that's fair. And I'll take your responses in theory. That's fine. And I, I guess my question really is for you. The gas can be coming from either direction, recognizing that Transco is a complicated universe in and of itself, the way molecules are bought and sold and actually moved around on the pipeline.
That is correct.
Okay. Okay. So the company, I want to make sure I understand, and Mr. Thomas, this is probably going to go to you, but either of y'all can answer it and just make sure, I want to come away understanding as much as I can. The company in its modeling assumptions, and we've talked a whole lot about this, and I hope y'all have Glenn Snyder's, the modeling panel's testimony, so we can look at that table. But the company made some assumptions about its ability to get gas into the state, natural gas supply. Help me understand, for purposes of its portfolios 1, 2, 3, and 4. Can you all help me understand exactly what those assumptions are?
Yeah, I just looking at the table, and this roughly corresponds to our comments. I think, our comments laid out our recommendations, and then we had subsequent discussions with Duke where modeling realities and other factors were taken into account to arrive at this kind of final table
Okay.
regarding the portfolio parameters. But
Okay, hang on, let me stop you there. When
Okay.
you say your comments, do you mean July 15 comments?
yes.
Okay.
yes.
So am I understanding you to say then that the comments the public staff made on July 15 were informed by subsequent discussion with Duke that went into the work you all did for purposes of your later filings in this docket?
I would say that, I guess what I was getting at was the comments we made on July 15th, made those comments, and then we sat down with you to hash out the details of how those comments would be implemented in our supplemental portfolios. And then that resulted in this, this table,
Okay.
SPA
All
1.
right, I'm with you.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
So we essentially, we first, starting at the, pulled out hydrogen that was blended into the natural gas, which affected the price and the emission rate. We stopped, we did not allow
Hang on,
CC.
tell me about the company's assumptions. The
Uh,
company's assumptions in 1 through 4, and then we'll get to what y'all did for 5 and 6, but 1 through 4.
Sure. So yeah, so in the 1 through 4, their base case was a limited Appalachian fuel supply case. They had existing CC fuel fleet was fueled in part by gas, and they had firm transportation for 2 new CCs. And then they did not have those CCs on backup fuel.
So do I understand correctly that those assumptions are really predicated on the development of MVP or the MVP Southgate asset and being able to procure capacity from those assets, one or both of those assets, to get gas into the state?
I believe so. Ms. Meth may expand. I don't know if the actual molecules would come from that MVP line, but the pricing contracts that were worked out would allow them access to that price. But I don't know if the molecules would necessarily come directly from there. But
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just, do you have, Mr. Matz, anything?
So trying to keep this simplified, so
So I can understand it.
no, so I can do a better job explaining it. That if MVP comes in at where it's proposed in Virginia,
Mhm.
you're still limited by the existing Transco system. The pipeline is the pipeline. MVP Southgate, which we treat as a separate project, would bring further capacity in a different part of the overall Transco system. In my words, potentially overcoming in part maybe that bottleneck that's occurring, in my words, at Station 166. So there would still be a limitation of the main Transco line, but that would at least enable the energy element, the commodity price to be brought in at that price. So if MVP came in where it's directly located, I believe there would still be a limitation on the main Transco price, on the main Transco line.
What do you mean a limitation on the, so, okay, let me ask it this way. So if MVP comes in and there's still a limitation on the Transco line, main line, it doesn't change things for Duke, right? I mean, it doesn't ameliorate the situation for Duke, right?
Unless Duke had contracts and they could potentially maybe do something going way far outside of my
Okay.
understanding, but there may be something where they're procuring contracts to and from. Remember, you're talking about you can bring energy element in from one place to the other.
Okay. And so that gets fairly complicated fairly quickly. So just for purposes of my limited understanding or ability to understand, so even if MVP were developed and MVP Southgate were not, that might free up some interstate pipeline capacity that could ameliorate the situation or make more capacity available for Duke to utilize for purposes of supplying its power generating stations.
That's my understanding.
Okay. All right. Okay, so Mr. Thomas, keep going.
Sure. So, and then in Duke's original portfolios, they modeled a no Appalachian fuel supply case. And so in this case, they fueled their existing CC fleet from Transco Zone 4 pricing, and then they estimated that they would not have incremental firm transport for new CCs. So these new CCs were still pulling natural gas, but then they modeled them during certain times of the year as running on ultra low sulfur diesel as an approximation of, we don't have firm transport, so we can't burn at this moment in time.
Okay, can you comment on the reasonableness of that assumption?
On the
Reasonableness of the assumption that that the gas-fired assets would have to run on ultra-low sulfur diesel at some
so
months of the year.
I think in the model they have it running on that backup for extended periods of time. I think in certain parts, it's a lot of low sulfur diesel you'd have to truck in to run these CCs at full bore. So I don't think that Mr. Metz may have more to share, but I don't believe that that's historically been the practice to run CCs on diesel fuel.
So do I understand then the case to be that the modeling was assuming that these gas assets would be running, when you say full bore, you mean on a full-time basis on the ultra-low sulfur diesel as opposed to on a few hours here and there, like some of the Duke's natural gas assets might have to do when they're relying on backup fuel, for example?
So
Just trying to understand.
yes,
the difference.
something to check. I'd have to revisit the modeling constraints that were included, but I think it may have been, I know that they have fuel supply constraints, and so there may have been, the backup fuel would be switched to when that supply is constrained.
Okay.
I'd have to revisit the modeling, so it's subject to check, but I think that's generally how it would approach.
Okay, so when I asked Mr. Snyder this question, he might be able to say what constraints that were utilized in the model to limit the time that these units were running on.
Yes, I think
ultra-low-
that panel could speak to more
Okay.
detail about the specific constraints that were used there.
Okay,
And the target is the month, going off memory, is the month of January in question.
okay, and that's clear in the testimony. Just trying to understand the very specifics there. Okay, now help me understand, and you all discussed this in the July 15 comments, and then in the Exhibit 1 to to the modeling panel's direct testimony, there's discussion of this. But I'm still not entirely clear on the reference to existing CC fleet fueled Transco 4, Transco Zone 4. Help me understand specifically what that means when we're referencing Transco Zone. I know what Transco Zone 4 is, but what does the reference to Transco Zone 4 there mean for Duke's operations?
So from a modeling standpoint, the model has different fuel prices for different zones. So let's say it has zone 3, zone 4, zone 5. It's just the model says, you want natural gas? Where can you get it from for pricing? You're going to use zone 4 pricing. That's what that is referencing.
And so when we say we want Zone 4 gas, do we mean actual gas or do we mean transportation? What do we?
That is referencing the zone 4 natural gas price
So the commodity price.
for the commodity. Yes.
And then also we talk about Zone 5 price volatility. Do I understand that correctly to mean that there's more price volatility in Zone 5 with respect to the commodity than there is in Zone 4?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
okay.
Although within the model, I just point out that the volatility is, other interviewers point this out, it's not entirely captured. There's seasonal monthly volatility, the price change is monthly, but not as volatile as the actual market where you have daily, hourly
Okay,
fluctuations.
and okay, thank you for pointing that out. So why is it appropriate to assume Zone 4 pricing as opposed to Zone 5 pricing? Connect those dots for me.
So this is a little bit of a evolving story, and I'll look over to Mr. Thomas too. So in our initial observation was in preparation of our comments, walking back in time, it says, okay, we looked at your model and what natural gas price was being used for these resources. We had an observation or concern that says zone 4, just using zone 4 for new combined cycles may not be representative of the actual energy price that you would actually procure in real time. You would probably be picking up something how it would be a average of all Duke's natural gas contracts just in real time. This is a mismatch between how we run the system in operations in real time versus what we're doing for modeling simplicity.
Okay.
So our initial observation says, look, zone 4 may be too low. That's why we want to use an average of zone 4 and zone 5, at least to pick up that knowingly that you probably can't just get zone 4 pricing.
Okay, so I'll stop you there. So is it possibly the case that Duke enters into contracts for gas and is able to negotiate a price? And is it the feeling that using the zone 4, or is it the public staff's opinion that using zone 4 and zone 5 combined or averaged, as you guys have done, is likely to approximate what Duke's actually going to have, better approximate what Duke's going to have to pay for the gas?
Yes, that was our attempt to address that concern.
Okay.
Understanding that it's not perfect and it doesn't address the intraday volatility.
Okay. Okay. The one thing that's kind of confused me is this no Appalachian gas, no Appalachian fuel supply case. We really mean, what we're really saying is not necessarily no Appalachian gas, but rather no MVP or MVP, no MVP plus MVP Southgate, right?
Yes,
'Cause-
yeah.
Okay. We're just using Appalachian as just a way to, okay.
And I think before it was MVP Southgate, I think 2018 IRP, we're talking about ACP and
Understood.
stuff like that. So
Understood. Okay. Okay.
For a commodity price, I mean, it was coming at a lower price than comparative to zone 4, zone 5 pricing. So if it comes in at a lower price and you direct assign that to any new natural gas generation unit, it's going to have a low unit cost for serving that given hour. So that was our conversation to ensure that we weren't putting too low of a price on looking out into the future, and it would essentially not force, but it would direct behavior to go ahead and pull in that resource.
Okay. So even if that makes sense to me, thank you, Mr. Metz. So, but even if let's say this MVP remains uncertain and just kind of continues in the litigation churn that it's in now, and that means MVP Southgate remains uncertain as well. Let's say Transco goes forward with its Southside reliability project and Duke's able to somehow take advantage of whatever capacity that creates in Transco and to North Carolina. Isn't it likely that they would procure Appalachian gas? I mean, wouldn't they be able to go out and buy that gas at that price since they can now get it into the state? Does my question make sense? And you can say no if it doesn't.
No, it makes sense. I'm getting a little bit out in front of my skis here on this particular topic, so that's
Okay.
why I'm being cautious of
Okay.
what information I provide.
Chair Mitchell, if you would like us to, or the commission would like us to provide a late filed exhibit from our natural gas section or offer up a natural gas witness, maybe next week, we could.
I mean, I'm curious about that. I understand, Mr. Metz. I know who these guys are and their backgrounds. And when he tells me he's out over his skis, I accept that. And that's fine. I'm just wanting to understand sort of and you tell me when you're in the territory you're not comfortable in, and that's okay. I'm just trying to understand what you all learned and were able to learn about these assumptions that they were using in their models.
So from my understanding is, remember, we talked about station 166. I don't see a project north of 166. So remember, we talked about your example. So get a bigger pipeline, we get more gas down, right? If I never increase the pipeline north of 166 going up to the Domstone South gas, I can never get that price down. The only thing that I freed up was from the upgrade down in the amount that it's in that zone.
Okay, I follow you now. That makes sense. And I'm going to ask the same questions of Mr. Snyder, so we'll hear what he says, or whomever on the modeling panel is in a position to answer them. So I appreciate your entertaining my questions and answering them. So, all right, Mr. Thomas, back to you. So then the changes you asked Duke to make in the natural gas supply assumptions for purposes of the additional modeling you all asked them to do? Explain those to me.
I think just at a high level, it resulted in a higher delivered price of gas to the fleet, both new and existing. And then there were constraints placed on the amount of existing of gas that was allowed to come in. And then the backup fuel for CTs and CCs was slightly modified. And then also we wanted to let the model to select between J class and F class, the 800 or the 1200 and 800 megawatt CC. So that's generally at a high level the changes that we push for on the gas side.
On the gas side, right? And I know there were other changes as well, but I'm just focusing now on the gas side. Okay. And at one point in your testimony, and you were testifying to someone, I don't remember who, but you said there were the sort of artificial constraints versus physical constraints in the model that you can make. And I think this is how I understood your testimony. So I want to make sure I'm right. An artificial constraint would be telling the model you can't select any CCs. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, in the absence of a statewide ban on combined cycles, that would be artificial. It wouldn't really reflect the reality.
Got it. It's just something you're imposing on the model kind of for an arbitrary
Yes.
reason. Okay.
Yes.
And then a physical constraint would be no new gas coming into the system.
Yeah, so that physical constraint in Encompass, you might put a limit on the daily imports of gas
Okay.
to reflect the actual constraints you expect. And that may lead to a CC not being selected, but that's up to the model then to decide whether it's worth to build a underutilized CC or not, right? So I think that's kind of the link.
Okay, and so I understood your testimony to be, and I understand sort of from, at least I think I understand from what's in the record now, that you all never went, you and Duke, the public staff and Duke, when discussing additional modeling work, never went so far as to say no new gas into the system. Is that right?
No, I don't believe we ran that type of sensitivity to say no incremental new gas.
No incremental new gas. And so I'm going to ask you to speculate, and I know that you're going to, I'm sort of anticipating your answer, but what happens if you tell it no new gas?
So I think more than likely what's going to happen there is it would definitely, more than likely not select the combined cycles. The CTs, it might still be able to select that because it could get, a CT might be able to run when and utilize other gas that's not being burned on the system or run on backup fuel. But the tighter you make the gas market, the less likely it would be to build a CC because you have a lot of capacity, and that certainly would contribute to the reserve margin requirements, but you wouldn't be able to actually generate during peak. So it would disincentivize the model to select that excessive expenditures.
Okay. And in supplemental portfolio 5, there are 2 CCs selected. Is that correct?
Yes.
Even with the constraints on gas supply, the model still selects 2 of the CCs. Okay.
Yeah.
And
I think, part of the choice of the model, right? So we've identified other issues like the optimization period doesn't know what's happening out beyond a certain time. And also just the general decline in gas consumption over time due to the introduction of new renewables. Those capacity factors are dropping. So, there's maybe in the very beginning when it's built, it's not able to run fully or it's maxing out that gas supply. But over time, as these CCs are utilized less, that creates additional headroom on the system.
okay. Okay. The carbon plan, do you all have the carbon plan in front of you? And I'm going to ask Mr. Snyder about this too, so you just do your best to answer. I know this is not the public staff's document. In Appendix N in the fuel supply section, I'm looking at page 7. That first paragraph, it's the first full paragraph on the page. And I'll paraphrase it, but the company's CC fleet is deficient of interstate pipeline firm transportation capacity due to cancellation of ACP. do y'all see that? And that point is made elsewhere. I think Mr. Snyder or the modeling panel make it in their direct testimony as well. So as we transition, as the companies continue to undergo this transition away from certain types of generating facilities to other types of generating facilities, and facilities are retired, and I'm mindful of Mr. Holman's testimony where he says we need to replace before we retire, but just thinking about the reliability of the system, does this address the concern that I have when I read the company's combined cycle fleet is currently deficient of interstate firm pipeline capacity? I mean, that's the existing fleet. Should I be concerned about reliability when I read that? Because earlier, when I asked you if y'all were concerned about the existing fleet, you said no, and you were fairly confident, which made me feel better. But what about the fact that this is in the carbon plan?
I did not, in full transparency, I did not pick up on them saying deficient. State more plainly, that's news to me, that our current combined cycle fleet is deficient.
Okay. Okay, and again, it appears in Mr. Snyder's testimony, and we'll give the modeling panel, or it appears in the modeling panel's testimony. Poor Mr. Snyder, I keep calling him out, but
And the only thing I would just add to that is I do think that this is taking into account, if they were to run all their CCs at full tilt, including their DFO plants running on the maximum amount of natural gas. And they do kind of discuss how they do have coal for, Blues Creek. Currently, they have coal for Blues Creek and Marshall. And so that may be a factor as well. But certainly, I think that it could be a concern in terms of keeping the lights on.
okay. Well, we'll let we'll let the modeling panel speak to the specifics, or the details underlying this paragraph in Appendix N. The public staff, I haven't heard the public staff say at any point, or haven't read testimony or read comments or heard you all provide in testimony since you've been on the stand, that you don't believe that natural gas isn't going to play an important role in this transition for the coming years. Is that correct? Do you want me to say that question again? Because I said I used to.
Yeah, please.
The public staff believes that the natural gas has an important role to play to manage the reliability of the system as the company moves away from or retires certain types of generation and brings on additional types of generation. Do I understand your position correctly?
Yeah, and I think I testified earlier about how, it does appear to be serving a transitional bridge role in the absence of, non-energy limited, firm dispatchable resources available now that are carbon free. It does appear to be serving that role and could be important to maintaining system reliability.
Okay,
I concur.
Okay, and you said could be important to maintain system reliability. Can you speak a little bit to that? Because I don't know if you heard the reliability panel's testimony a couple of days ago, but speak to the role that these assets will play with respect to reliability.
So, not speaking for Ms. Thomas, I think when we say could be, I mean, we are looking at this till 2050. I mean, we're looking at this over the long term. When we say could be, is like our expectation is that as technology evolves and Duke can implement it in its system, yes, we may not be as dependent upon CTs as we currently are. I mean, because that's a function just because we don't have, using battery storage as examples, we don't have a large penetration of battery storage in our system. So as we're looking ahead, we expect that the operation standpoint to potentially shift to say, okay, well, yes, we currently have this set of tools, I believe as Mr. Holman was testifying. In the future, we're going to have a different set of tools, and we're going to continue to evaluate and readjust as we move forward in time.
And I guess if I could add on to the reason I said could be was natural gas is not the only thing that can provide firm dispatchable resources. If there was a federal ban on new natural gas pipelines, if no new gas came into North Carolina, natural gas may not be an option. New natural gas may not even be a physical option anymore, in which case you may need to then start potentially delaying coal retirements to maintain the voltage support, ancillary services, that are required. You may need to invest in significantly larger quantities of solar and solar plus storage and wind than are envisioned in the carbon plan in the absence of natural gas capacity. I mean, it's possible. Their batteries and solar and intermittent resources combined can provide system reliability if it's properly overly built and there's sufficient energy that's being able to charge those batteries to provide that. But that's very expensive as well. That can be very expensive. And as the reliability panel testified to, there's not a lot of experience in the system operations room in managing that type of fleet. So I think could be is just kind of looking out at the uncertainty of what we have coming in. If MVP and MVP Southgate collapse and this permitting reform bill is unsuccessful and they are never built or never completed, and that could force North Carolina to start looking at other different options that in the absence of the ability to build new gas plants, particularly the combined cycles that have been identified in almost every portfolio that we've looked at in the near term.
Okay. The Commissioner Clodfelter asked a couple of questions. I think he asked to the modeling panel, but he could have asked to one of the other panels about Belews Creek 1 and 2 that are currently firing at 50% natural gas. Is that y'all's understanding that they're firing at 50%?
They have up to 50%. Look over to my left. I believe it is non-firm for Blues Creek, up to 50% on each unit, non-firm.
And Commissioner Clodfelter, you can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but I think he asked, have we looked at taking those to 100% or closer to 100%? And he received an answer to that. But do you all have any thoughts or do you have any experience? Can you provide us any response to that question?
I'm thinking just for context of the conversion, there's a few elements to consider and more than just a few. But you have to get the fuel supply there. So you have to look at the natural gas pipeline. I mean,
Back to the pipeline issue.
back to the pipeline issue and whether or not you can actually get that 365 service per that quantity. So if I would look at it, say, okay, well, Blues Creek is a larger unit site in terms of megawatts. So if I want 100%, means I need more throughput or more gas coming off the system. Then if I want it firm 365, then that's another evaluation. To go further into the mechanics of the overall system, then you need to look at it and say, all right, now if I am going to burn 100% natural gas instead of 50%, you have to start considering in multiple other elements and whether how the internals of the system can actually handle that, handle the temperatures, handle the pressure, and go through every part of the plant all the way up to the turbine and see if it can handle those changes. I have not formed that analysis. I don't even know if I'm qualified to go through an entire coal plant to see if we can do that change.
Okay, and so what I'm hearing you say is we shouldn't assume just because it's been converted to burn a certain percentage of natural gas that it could go beyond that cost effectively and practically. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
That is correct. And again, take that a step further to say, all right, well, for a coal plant that was converted, it does not have the same efficiencies or references heat rate as compared to a combined cycle. So you have to start taking in that. So if I have a rounding numbers, if I have a 30% less efficient combined cycle or a coal plant converted over to DFO, it's going to be very expensive over the long term. It may be more cost effective in a perfect world to go with the other scenario and leave it alone.
Okay, do you know anything about, do you all know anything about Duke's decision to take those 2 units only to 50%? I mean, could that decision have been informed by this type of analysis that you're describing should be done?
It was my understanding that, because we reviewed this during the general rate case, it was my understanding that this was a balance of fuel supply and the cost to get firm 365 service. To go up to 50% was a cost balance of saying we're going to go non-firm and only go up to 50%.
When you were talking about firm and non-firm, we're talking about Transco capacity again. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Just making sure, because, we talk about different types of service from the LDC to these plants. And so when we're having these conversations, I want to make sure we're clear on, are we talking about Transco capacity? Are we talking about interruptible service from the LDC?
There is also a function of the LDC if they tap into the LDC, because the LDC is responsible for its pipeline pressure. So if you look at where you connect a high demand on a certain pipe, if you pull up too much, you could have a pressure change, and that would require the LDC to beef up or upbuild its system. Then you also have to compare that cost and see whether it's worth it or not.
Okay, that's helpful. And I know that I've asked you to sort of go over your skis again. All right. Mr. Thomas, you've provided pretty extensive testimony at this point, so I'm not going to belabor this much more than I have to, but you've provided extensive testimony about the experience with Encompass that the public staff had this time, and we've heard from some of the intervening parties about their experience with Encompass. Is there anything that the commission should do to try to head off or address the issues the public staff had in utilizing Encompass?
So, yeah, I think there are some things that I think, and, in full, transparency, I think some of the issues may have arisen simply because of the compressed time frame that Duke had to perform all this modeling with Encompass and share this data in a way that is not really precedented in terms of sharing modeling inputs like they have. So I don't want to say that this was something that necessarily won't be addressed by Duke, and I hope that they will. But yeah, I think that there's steps such as, I spoke earlier about calculations of conversion of capital cost into model inputs and taking model outputs and converting them to present value of revenue requirements. There's worksheets and documentations that they've done kind of for some of the interim steps that I think would be helpful. I'd like to see those potentially in future carbon plans provided contemporaneously with the Encompass inputs. And I applaud Duke for providing all those inputs right away, but obviously the challenges that everyone ran into immediately set us back some time. And I think this is hopefully something that the commission can address or Duke can address, but taking once Duke exports its data sets before they upload into Encompass, into the data site to share with interveners, I think it would be helpful for them to take it and import it into a fresh database and just validate that, they don't have to rerun every model, but rerun a few models and just validate that they're getting the same results so that we don't have these same import issues that we were kind of experiencing.
Okay. The additional Encompass question for you. The dynamic dispatch issue. I mean, we've heard about the fixed dispatch for the solar plus storage, and then you all asked them to take that to convert to or change to the dynamic dispatch.
Mm-hmm.
And we've heard from Duke about the sort of the practical implication of that was it made the model spin for 36 hours as opposed to just a few hours. And so do you envision I talked about this some with the modeling panel, but will that improve with time as the model gets more sophisticated?
That's a good question.
Practical limitations of the model.
Yeah.
Will they improve with time as the model gets more sophisticated?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure now. I know computer hardware is always getting more advanced, and so it is possible that changes to the servers that Duke's running on or the computers that interveners are running on could help decrease model run times. That there could be optimizations within the Encompass code, that's the linear optimization algorithm, that could provide decreases in model run times. Encompass Anchor Power Solutions has a team of software engineers, and I'm sure they're always looking to optimize these things. And then in addition, there's other discussions with Anchor Power Solutions on what what might be done, even just modeling decisions that could help improve the time. I think the dynamic dispatch of solar plus storage was very impactful. Maybe there's another way that we can kind of approach this in the future, but I think that that's very important. And there may be trade-offs where perhaps fewer tranches of, renewable resources. Right now they have multiple tranches associated with different levels of interconnection costs. All of those different resources. So there's like 6 different standalone solar resources in both DEC and DEP. Getting rid of that or narrowing that down, that in itself can reduce runtime, and then you can kind of trade off and use the more computationally expensive dynamic dispatch while you're trimming other areas that maybe are a little less material. And then obviously, if the companies merged or combined, and now the number of resources that you are modeling are literally cut in half because you no longer have a DAC and a DAP. It's just a Duke. And so I think that there's obviously benefits there, but we've shared our position on other benefits of a merger as well.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to ask you all some questions about the red zone. Were you all able to hear the testimony that provided by Mr. Roberts and Ms. Farber, the transmission panel several days ago?
Yes.
Okay. I understood their testimony to be that costs associated with certain of the red zone expansion projects were included in the modeling work. Is that your understanding as well?
My understanding of this, and that Duke used a generic network upgrade cost for new solar. And that was, it was generic, but it was based on historically looking back at interconnection studies. And when you look at the total investment related in network upgrades associated with solar that the model selected, it approximately was equal, I think, to the red zone plan in dollar amount. But I don't know that the red zone upgrades weren't added in or forced in. I think it was that was my understanding with conversations with the Duke team. But
so is it then your understanding, or let me make sure I understand your understanding, that the transmission adder that Duke used reflects the cost of those red zone projects, or some of them?
So yeah.
So yeah, the foundation of this was the studies coming out of the transition cluster study. So coming out of the transition cluster study, I believe we went over this in more detail during the Juno hearing. I believe that DEP had a higher cost per unit energy or per kW comparative to DEC. For purposes of the modeling, we averaged them. Public staff does not take issue with that approach. We believe that is a rough level magnitude approximation of transmission upgrades across the system because we don't know exactly where projects are going to interconnect. So the number is rooted in the results of the transition cluster study.
If I could just clarify that, the transitional cluster study, that formed the basis. My understanding, like Mr. Metz said, formed the basis for the transmission adders used in the model. That transitional cluster study triggered some, but not all of the red zone upgrades. So yeah, to that extent, some of those were included and then some were not. If they weren't triggered by the TCS, the transitional cluster study, then I don't believe they would have been included in that calculation of the transmission cost adder.
Okay. Did you all hear the panel provide its testimony on the supplemental study it did, I think of it as the 5400 study, but it was the 1900 in DEC and the 30 plus in DEP. And did you all take any issue or have anything to add to their testimony on that study and what it adds to this on this issue?
Part of that study, so we met and had conversations with the Duke team on that overall study and addressed to them some of our observations or concerns is more detailed in Mr. Roberts and Ms. Farber's testimony. They addressed those concerns. That study kept the 60-40 split at the same allocation that was set forth or prescribed within the model of the carbon plan, and it looked at both the historic part, both inside and outside the red zone, and we tried to address what are the most common upgrades that we have historically seen. And again, in my opinion, a a positive item that came out of here is we looked at inside and outside the red zone, and we came up with the most common, or in this case is referred to the most least regrets transmission upgrades that we can partake within the Carolina system.
And if I could just add, I don't want to necessarily speak for Mr. Metz, but he addresses this in his testimony. I would not, I don't think we view, the supplemental transmission study was definitely helpful in helping to confirm that least regrets path for the red zone, but we didn't view it as necessarily replacing the other recommendations Mr. Metz made in his testimony regarding proactive transmission planning. It's kind of like a stopgap measure to validate this first step, but we still need to look at, this longer term planning for the transmission system.
And it was also identified, I believe Commissioner Codfelder had highlighted this during his questions, there are still more upgrades there. In my view, is we are addressing the backbone of the system, if you would, to the extent that we've had continued upgrades or continued projects seek interconnection in these areas. There will be more upgrades. There will be more upgrades. And as we move forward, and that's what I think Mr. Thomas is pointing to, it's we need to be looking at the next set. What is the step after this? This is going to help us transition to this point. But if we want to continue this pace of growth, we need to look at the next set. We need to look at where it's going and start planning accordingly.
So have you all started that yet?
No, I have not.
And how do you do that?
Working on that.
Okay.
I look
So-
forward to input from the transmission operators and as well as others.
So when you say proactive transmission planning, what specifically do you mean? How does that how does that distill down into action items?
So a hypothetical, let's say we're looking at the next set of upgrades and we want an additional 5 gigawatts of solar, and let's say we want it all located in a concentrated area, and let's just specify a DEP in the southeast. We would take that back to the Duke Energy planning folks and say, how can we potentially accomplish this task? And let's start talking about it now, what upgrades would occur. And it's not to scare the commission, but to the extent to say, okay, the system is now at a saturation point. We cannot do more on our existing 230 kV system, or we cannot do more on our existing 500 kV system. We now have to build a new line, and let's say that's a new 500 kV line. That is a decade plus process, and all the challenges and hurdles and most likely potential multiple state implications as we transition a potential new line, whether 230 or 500 kV. So that's what I'm talking about. Proactive upgrades is, I mean, this is a good first step, but what's next? So again, if the commission said, do you want to go forward to offshore wind, and you set a potential target, well, it's important to understand. I mean, I think, can't speak for the Duke folks, but at least for me, you want 800 megawatts, or do you want 5,000 megawatts, or do you want 2,500 megawatts? That input will help provide proactive planning. And to the extent that it can be locational guidance on top of that, will even more facilitate a more narrow focus and how we can evaluate have a smaller lens, if you would, to look at a two-state system across multiple lines.
Thomas, are you wanting to add something?
Oh, no, I just wanted, we did discuss this a little bit on about page 113, 114 of our initial comments. I was looking back at some of that, and we were talking about, potentially, making sure that it's expanding its horizon for transmission planning and working with NCTPC to ensure that the carbon plan results are kind of factored into its future planning to the extent that location may not be known, but there are tools that Duke has used and presented in this model that kind of show where solar is likely to be located, where the best potential is, and trying to map that. And we've obviously also spent a lot of time here talking about transmission. So I'd be remiss to not mention that we've also very concerned about the cost burdens on DP ratepayers associated with significant build outs of the transmission system in DP's territory. to assist in meeting the Carolinas carbon plan, and we want to make sure that that's addressed as well.
So should I ask my questions about that issue to you all, or I was holding them for Mr. McLaughlin, but should I hold them?
You can ask and we might defer.
All right. Okay, so, one last question, Mr. Thomas, going back to something you said, the dynamism on the SPS, solar plus storage dispatch. You said it was I think your words were very impactful. You might have just said impactful, but so,
Mhm.
you know, why?
So the way that Duke modeled it originally was they used I think I've explained this before, they used the pricing periods established and avoided costs to kind of say, we'll charge during these times and discharge in those times. And that generally recognizes that there's a need for capacity in the winter morning, and it kind of reacted like that, but it set those throughout the whole planning horizon. The rate periods that were set in sub 158 and approved in sub 167 reflect no onshore wind, no offshore wind. They reflect a lot more coal generation. It was a kind of a historical look back based upon that. And so as the system changes, when you get more onshore wind, or offshore, or even offshore wind, or SMRs, the need for that winter capacity right then is that solar and storage might be providing, it might be diminished somewhat. You might need to discharge it at other hours of the day. So I think that allowing the model to pick and choose how it dispatches those storage, to me, I think it was probably one of the most material changes to resource selections. That it was likely it likely was one of the most contributing factors to the changes in resource selections that we saw in SP5. And that's not only the shift away from standalone solar to standalone solar plus storage. I think that in and of itself, right, is an acknowledgement that it was more valuable to the system to be able to dispatch that, but also how it shifted around other resources and even delayed a CC. I mean, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but I do think that contributed to being allowed to dispatch those, hundreds and even thousands of megawatts of storage.
All right. Thank you all oh, Mr. Williamson, I do have one for you. I'm not gonna let you off the hook. Do you, what can you tell me about the level of coordination between Duke and its wholesale customers on load management activities?
So I'm gonna try and refresh my memory a little bit. I know I talked about it in my testimony. Maybe it was just briefly. So the only information that I can provide you on, I guess, my knowledge of the conversations that Duke's having with its wholesale customers is, and it might be applicable, it might not be applicable, but it's just the conversations from, well, I guess I'm gonna take that back. I'm confusing the wholesale customers with the industrial customers. So I'm not aware of any conversations that are going on between the wholesale customers and Duke specifically on load management.
All right, thank you for that. All right, that's it for me. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Mr. Thomas, one follow-up on the chair's questions about Encompass capabilities. Do you have any opinion about whether it would be worthwhile, worth the effort, worth the brain cells, worth the money to add functionality in Encompass that would allow the model to model bidirectional charging of batteries?
I do. I think that could be valuable, either as
Is it worth the effort?
So I think the fact is it's worth the effort for APS, for Anchor Power Solutions, but they're the ones who'd have to probably write the code and implement that. But yeah, I think that would be worth it. Maybe even to completely replace, the DC only that can only charge from the solar array. I think that would be very worth it. I hope Anchor Power Solutions implements that. I know at the last users meeting, they mentioned that that was hopefully an upcoming addition. So
So they're working on it now.
I believe so.
Okay.
That's what they told us.
That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
So one follow-up on the proactive transmission planning. What are y'all's views on GETS, the grid enhancing technologies, dynamic line ratings, as well as the, I'm not getting this right, but the cabling that may be more expensive, but, can provide for more power flow?
So Duke Energy, Duke Energy Progress, Duke Energy Carolinas already have different programs of dynamic line rating in place and using today. Now, there are differences between the two programs, and they can probably explain better because I'll probably get them mixed up. But there may be some more synergies that they can leverage off their existing programs. Not saying what their existing programs are wrong. There's always the process. There's always the potential for improvement. In terms of GITS, grid enhancing technologies, it is a potential solution. I have my reservations of the large scale deployment that could be done and what cost savings could occur. If you look at if we're deploying a technology to overcome a NERC standard, well, what happens if that technology fails? What happens if on that day, on that hot day or that cold day that technology fails? What it can do, I don't understand good enough. I don't understand the relationship, how Duke will need to model that. To me, that's still a N-1 failure. So I have a line rating. I want to use this technology. What happens if the technology fails? Are we right back to the ground zero? Was that a prudent investment if we have to plan if it fails? So I don't understand that relationship strong enough at this point in time. I missed the third question that you had.
Probably using the wrong words, but the cabling that can enhance power flows.
Yes, so there's different types of cablings, and I'll just try to simplify it to two: ACSR and ACSS. ACSS will typically allow you more current carrying capability. And review sort of through some of the plans that Duke had listed within the CERC TP process. Some of those upgrades already underway, notably in Duke Energy Carolinas area, already in the red zone, or employing the ACSS. And I can point to a couple examples if you want me to, but other than it's just Duke is implementing it.
Okay, that's sufficient.
I was just going to
Thomas?
say, just at a high level, I think the public staff would support implementation of any cost-effective and reliable technology that could help avoid some transmission upgrades or transmission constraints, as long as it's cost-effective and maintains system reliability.
I agree.
Okay, thank you.
Hopefully this is a real quick question. The PVRR calculations, you've talked about what's in Encompass and what's not. And is that coming directly out of Encompass, or are you taking a stream of investments and handing it over to someone with a big monster spreadsheet?
So the PVR that is presented in Duke is composed of, and I'll try to keep this as high level as I can, is composed of multiple categories like new generation capacity, revenue requirement, and new transmission capacity, and EE and DSM, and production costs. Generally, when you're calculating that PVR, the only thing that's really coming out of Encompass is the production costs, any carbon costs if those were included, and fixed fuel demand costs. Other than that, like the new generation capital costs, the revenue requirement for transmission, EE, DSM, those are all calculated in a big monster spreadsheet that's kind of external to the model. My understanding is that the model, if you load the proper financial characteristics into it and inputs, and it could kind of spit you out those numbers. But I also recognize that the way that Duke's doing it now is the way that they did it in System Optimizer and ProSim, and so they're using tools that are familiar to them as they make this transition. but I'd hope to see them utilize more of the Encompass innate functionality to calculate these financial outputs in the future.
So when you were looking at the results of those and there's debates about, you know, which scenario is more expensive and we're all looking at the PVRR, that is partially an output of Encompass, but then that's a financial model that includes assumptions about discount factors and, you know, various finance assumptions. Is that right?
Yeah, generally. I mean, it's still linked to Encompass, you know, the generation, transmission, PVR. You take the capacity expansion plan. When are you placing these units in service, and what year, and how many megawatts? And you plug those into a spreadsheet, and then it calculates the levelized fixed charge rate and the discount rate and any long-term and short-term costs, and it kind of puts it in an annual cumulative revenue requirement out through time, and then that's discounted back to give you the PVR. So it's linked to Encompass, but I can't take, Encompass puts output in Excel. I can't go to that Excel spreadsheet and sum or figure out what is the actual new generation PVRR. So it's just an extra step that's kind of, it results in kind of some difficulties in, being able to quickly analyze Encompass data in a way that doesn't require multiple spreadsheets and linked calculations.
Okay, I have a few other questions, but I think I'm going to hold off to other witnesses. Thank you. That's very helpful.
All right, questions on commissioners' questions, if there are any.
Yes, Your Honor, I do. Yes, Chair Mitchell. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I just wanted to follow up on Chair Mitchell's questions about whether there were things that, I think she phrased it as, were there things the commission could order that would assist in addressing the issues and utilizing Encompass? Would it be helpful if the commission ordered the companies, staff, and other interested modeling parties to meet relatively soon after the commission were to issue its order on the 2022 carbon plan to discuss inputs that might be run through Encompass models for purposes of the 2024 plan?
Sorry, you said meeting after this order in preparation for 2024, or?
Would it be possible, would it be helpful if the parties could sort of narrow their areas of disagreement and sort of agree on what inputs the companies would model when the time came for them to actually begin the modeling process for the 2024 carbon plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that'd be helpful. I'm always a fan of collaboration. Duke has held multiple meetings with modelers to kind of work out some of these issues, both after and even before to kind of prepare. So I think that would be helpful to sit down always.
Well, and let me clarify. Specifically, what I mean is for the parties to agree that Duke is going to model X, Y, or Z amounts of solar paired with storage, whatever, to see if you could reach a consensus position on what Duke would model specifically.
You mean like the modeling inputs, like capital costs and stuff like that?
Correct.
I mean, we had multiple stakeholder meetings, both larger groups and smaller groups, to focus on, some pretty granular data in terms of the costs and stuff like that. I don't think it's possible to reach agreement on all these inputs before the carbon plan was filed. If it was, we wouldn't be here right now. So I to the extent that there are things we can agree on, sure, that I think that'd be helpful, or sources. But I think the stakeholder process that we had here with, I think it was 3 bigger meetings and then some more technical breakout meetings, I think that was very helpful. And if that's kind of what that was all before the carbon plan was filed. If that's what you're envisioning, I think I support that. But if we're seeking, like, we have to agree on the dollar per kW value for solar before Duke runs any models, I don't think that's possible.
Okay, thank you. That's the only question I had.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Mr. Williamson, you were asked a couple questions by both Commissioner Hughes and Commissioner McKissick regarding EEDSM measures, including some questions about different buckets of funding for those measures. Do you recall those questions?
Are you talking about the IRA?
That's correct.
Okay.
Aside from utility-funded EEDSM measures and separate government subsidy funding like the IRA would provide for, there's also a third bucket of funding, specifically as it relates to opted-out customers investing in their own EEDSM measures on their own dime. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. They have industrial, large commercial customers, I mean, they have their own self-service to themselves to make their plants as efficient as possible.
And for the EEDSM measures that are privately funded by those customers, those costs would not then be recovered through the EEDSM rider. Is that correct?
Correct. Like I was just discussing with Commissioner Hughes, essentially the only dollars that roll through the DSMEE rider are dollars that are spent to encourage customers to participate in the utilities programs.
And meaning those privately funded EEDSM measures are implemented at no cost to other ratepayers.
Correct.
Is there currently a way for Duke to get credit for non-utility funded EEDSM measures implemented by opted out industrial and commercial customers?
I'm not sure what you mean by credit.
Is there a way to, let me back up. Did you hear the exchange that was had with Duke witnesses Huber and Duff on this issue?
Somewhat, was a few days ago.
Okay, I'll save the rest for rebuttal for that panel then. Thank you.
Take that as a no question.
Mr. Snowden may have a question, but I do not.
Okay. Did you have questions?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
All right.
Just a couple. Mr. Metz, I read Mr. Roberts' testimony on the transmission panel to take the position that it's important that North Carolina develop a process to integrate resource planning and transmission planning. Did you see that?
Yes.
Okay, and would you agree with that?
Yes, and I think that's some of the findings that were coming out of the public staff's public policy request that we submitted to the NCTPC.
Okay, thank you. And so you've been involved with the public staff, you've been involved with the Transmission Advisory Group, right?
That is correct.
Okay, and you had a part in that, that public policy study?
That is correct.
Okay. Based on your experience with TAG and with the public policy study, do you think that it's possible for the NCTPC on its own to handle that integrated transmission and resource planning function?
Yes, I mean, that primary function, I mean, is simplified. I mean, it is another model, but a transmission model to essentially look at generation interconnection studies.
Okay, thanks. I guess what I'm getting at is the TPC equipped to do the resource planning sort of side of the equation?
Objection. I think we're well beyond the scope of any specific question now that we're getting into the TPC doing resource planning.
I believe Chair Mitchell asked the panel a couple of questions, and I am just trying to get Mr. Metz's perspective on this question. I believe Chair Mitchell asked some questions of the panel about the TPC specifically, so I'm just following up on that. And I apologize, I don't remember the specific question, but
I'm not sure I remember asking about the TPC, but it's been a long day. So
it may specifically have been
may have.
the integration of resource planning and transmission
just ask
planning.
try to ask one question and then let's move on. Just
Okay, sure.
Get what you need from them.
Sure. Can the TPC handle the resource planning side of that integrated planning?
It'd be my understanding that coming out of the carbon plan should help inform the new generation for evaluating future upgrades. But at the same token is I don't want to undermine the public policy requests that can also, or the other requests that can also potentially look at different resources for potential transmission sensitivities. So stay different, yes and no.
Okay, thanks. And do you know of any other states or utilities that are doing integrated transmission and resource planning?
I'm not cognizant of any, but I haven't been doing extensive research on the topic.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Metz, Commissioner Duffley asked you a couple of questions about grid enhancing technologies. Do you remember that?
Yes,
Okay, and you mentioned specifically dynamic line ratings, and you said that Duke was already using dynamic line ratings. Is that right?
that's correct.
Okay. Would you agree that Duke is using dynamic line ratings for operational purposes, but is not using it for transmission planning purposes?
I'm gonna stay within my lane. I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. And have you read Duke's comments with regard to grid enhancing technologies and specifically dynamic line ratings in the FERC NOPR docket on transmission planning?
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, thanks. Those are all questions I have.
Public staff. Did you have any? Yeah, I was, okay.
Mr. Metz, you got a few questions on red zone projects and proactive transmission planning. Would you agree that the public staff came to its position on the subset of red zone upgrades and proactive transmission plan, that proactive transmission planning is needed to alleviate, at least in part, its concerns about continuous upgrading or rebuilding of the same lines due to multiple interconnection requests?
In part, yes.
Thank you.
All right, I think we have come to the end of this panel's examination. I'll take motions.
Chair Mitchell, the public staff would move that Metz Exhibit 1, attach the pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. Metz, be entered into the record and marked for identification as pre-marked, and that the testimony summaries of Metz, Thomas, and Williamson, pre-filed in the sub 179A docket, be moved into the record.
All right, Mr. Metz's exhibit will be identified as it was when pre-marked and will be admitted into evidence, and the testimony summaries for each of the panelists will be copied into the record as if given orally from the stand at the appropriate time. Any additional motions? Go ahead.
Chair Mitchell, for the purpose of consistent naming conventions, I wanted to ask whether you would like for me to ask that my previously marked and identified exhibits be renamed so that they are consistent with subsequent cross-examination of this panel.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I would ask that SIGFR 2 and 3, public staff, Thomas, Metz, and Williamson panel cross-examination exhibits 1 and 2 be renamed. SIGFR 2 and 3, public staff, panel 1, cross-examination exhibits 1 and 2, and I'd ask for those to be moved into the record at the appropriate time.
All right, the documents will be so identified and they will be accepted into evidence.
Thank you.
Duke would ask that Duke Energy Public Staff Panel 1 cross-examination exhibits 1 through 4 be entered into the record.
All right, motions allowed. Okay. Okay, anything else?
Tech customers would ask that tech customers, public staff panel 1, cross-examination exhibit 1 be moved into the evidence.
All right,
moved into
motions allowed.
evidence.
Madam Chair, I would propose that the commission take judicial notice of the document I asked the panel about. That's the motion to intervene in comments of Piedmont Natural Gas Company filed in Federal Energy Regulatory Commission docket number CP 22-461-000 on June 28, 2022.
All right, we will take judicial notice as requested by Commissioner Clodfelter. All right, anything else before we excuse the witnesses? All right, gentlemen, you may step down. Thank you very much for your testimony today. All right. Call
The
your,
public staff now calls panel 2, James McLonghorn and Michelle Boswell, to the stand.
as the witnesses approach, I will say we were scheduled to end at 3 o'clock today. In the interest of allowing the commissioners to attend to other business, we don't have the luxury of ending that early today if we're going to try to get through this hearing. So we're going to go till 5. And my hope is that we can get through this panel as well as the 3 panelists that have requested to be heard, but we're not going to stay past 5. So just letting everyone know for planning purposes. All right, let me get y'all sworn in. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All right, thank you.
Ms. Boswell, would you please state your name, business address, and current position for the record?
Michelle M. Boswell. My address is 430 North Salisbury Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. I am the Director of Accounting for the Public Staff.
And on September 2nd, 2022, did you prepare and cause to be pre-filed direct testimony in this docket consisting of 10 pages and 1 appendix?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony?
No.
If you were asked the same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Did you prepare a summary of your testimony, and did you file that summary in the E-100 sub 179A docket?
I did.
Mr. McLawhorn, would you please state your name, business address, and current position for the record?
My name is James McLawhorn. My business address is 430 North Salisbury Street, Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm the Director of the Public Staff's Energy Division.
And on September 2nd, 2022, did you prepare and cause to be pre-filed direct testimony in this docket consisting of 23 pages and 1 appendix?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony?
Yes, I do. On page 6, table 1, very first line for August 1st, 2007. I'll wait and let everybody get there. Page 6, table 1. The amount, bill amount shown for DEC should be $86.99 instead of $87.99. So $86.99, and that changes the percent difference in the third column to 9.9%.
Thank you. And other than that change, if you were asked the same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Did you prepare a summary of your testimony, and did you cause to be pre-filed that summary in the E-100 sub 179A docket?
Yes, I did.
Chair Mitchell, at this time, I move that the pre-filed direct testimony and summaries of testimony of public staff witnesses Boswell and McLawhorn be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
All right, motion is allowed.
The panel is available for cross-examination.
John Burns for CCBA. I have a very few questions that the prior panel deferred to you. The quick question I have, ma'am, is when I think the prior panel agreed that it would be necessary to develop commercial terms to allow Duke Energy the dispatch of solar and solar plus storage resources that are the dispatch that's required in House Bill 951. And my question to you is, would you agree that it is important for those terms to fairly compensate operators and owners for the resources that they make available? For the commercial terms. This was deferred to this panel, wasn't it? I believe it was. If not, I'll ask the next person. I'm sorry. I'm so used to looking across at Jack on that one. So I believe that the prior panel deferred that question, but no? Okay.
I don't recall that, but.
Okay. But I think the issue's covered. I'll withdraw the question. Thank you. If I was confused, I'm sorry.
All right, Sigford.
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. Good afternoon, Ms. Boswell and Mr. McLawhorn. Ms. Boswell, does the public staff believe this proceeding should be treated as a 62-110.7 proceeding for approval to incur nuclear development costs?
We do not.
Thank you. Mr. McLawhorn, in your role as the Director of the Energy Division for the public staff, Do you evaluate jurisdictional and customer class allocation methodologies and issues?
Yes, I do, along with other members of the Energy Division.
Did you hear Ms. Bateman's testimony in response to my cross-examination?
I did.
Do you believe there is regulatory risk that the Public Service Commission of South Carolina denies carbon plan implementation costs?
Okay, I want to understand your question exactly. Are you asking me, do I believe that there is a risk that the Public Service Commission of South Carolina might not approve carbon plan costs? Is that what you're?
That's correct.
Is that, well, there's always a risk in any proceeding in one jurisdiction that a regulatory commission in another jurisdiction might not allow the same thing.
Would you categorize this specific risk here in this docket for this jurisdictional cost allocation issue as minimal, moderate, or substantial?
I really have no way to evaluate that. I mean, I'm not privy to the goings on of the South Carolina Public Service Commission and what their opinions are. I mean, that it is a risk, but I don't know how great.
Fair enough. Do you think it would be reasonable to require Duke to model a scenario in which the Public Service Commission of South Carolina denies cost recovery of carbon plan costs?
It would certainly be one thing to look at. I think if if this commission is concerned about that and would like to know what that those modeling results show, then they're certainly welcome to order Duke to do that.
Thank you. Nothing further.
All right, Luca? All right, redirect.
One question. Ms. Boswell, why does the public staff not think it's appropriate to consider this proceeding to be under 62-110.7?
Upon our reading of 62-110.7, specifically subsection B, they are required to request it and provide full details associated with the request. In the present case, although they have, in my reading, they have not specifically indicated the 62-110-7 request. Additionally, the public staff did request some detailed information, and the company was unable to provide such information.
And Ms. Boswell, what kind of detailed information was that?
The detailed costing, O&M, and capital expenses related to the SMRs.
And is that the type of information the public staff would need to determine a cap and a time limit between reviews?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, questions from commissioners? Commissioner Gladfelter.
Yeah, I think, Mr. McLaughlin, you mentioned in your testimony that you were comfortable, I forget the exact words, but you were comfortable with the way the PVRR was done, except you were comfortable with the inputs, but you had some questions about whether there were sufficient things added into some of the calculations for all the different that were common among all the different scenarios. As far as the first part of that question, you were just comfortable with how it was done.
Basically how the math was carried out.
Right. And I'm a math guy. That's what I was curious about. So did you have a chance to actually see that? Because I understand it was done not in the Encompass, but it was done in sort of a separate model. Did the public staff have an opportunity to actually look at that, I guess, cash flow model or cost benefit? I mean, excuse me, PV analysis?
I did not personally evaluate that. Our modeling panel, who was Mr. Thomas, who was just up, was the one who, to the extent that was looked at, that was him.
Okay, well, I'll take my questions, I guess, to the next modeling panel, which happens to be Mr. Schneider and friends. So.
Actually, I did have one question for Ms. Boswell on page 9 of your testimony. So line 6 and 7, that sentence ends that the public staff does not recommend approval of any nuclear project development cost at this time. And when you're speaking of that, you're speaking of costs for cost recovery. And is that, that's how I read it. And is that different than an approval to engage in the activities themselves?
From my perspective with cost recovery, I believe the panel 1 discusses approval to participate in any activities related to SMRs.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Commissioner Kimmerer. Okay. Mr. McLaughlin, I'm trying to find it. I seem to recall either in public staff comments or in your testimony, citation to the commission's order directing public staff and the companies to get to work addressing rate disparity issues between the two operating companies. Can you update me on the status of that work?
We have had some conversations with the company, but I would not classify them as advanced. Now, I'm not commenting on what the company may be doing internally, but we've had some preliminary discussions with the company as to what that might look like, but nothing firm.
Were you able to listen to Ms. Bateman's testimony? And I asked her about my perception of the exigency or the urgency that the public staff has conveyed about the disparity in rates and the need to address that. And I think I understood her response to be, we have some time to do that before sort of the costs associated with the actions we're describing in the carbon plan but become passed on to ratepayers. We have some time to think about cost allocation and take additional steps like the other regulatory concepts that the company has proposed or has discussed in its testimony in this proceeding. Do you share, to the extent I haven't mischaracterized or misunderstood Ms. Bateman's position, and she's going to be up again so she can help us understand if I have, but do you agree that there isn't an immediate need to address cost allocation, that we have some time to address that, or help me understand exactly what you think we need to do and when we need to do it?
I think that you have accurately characterized Ms. Bateman's testimony. At least that's how I heard her. That's my recollection. I do not share that view. In my opinion, we need to be about this as soon as possible. First of all, we don't even know if a merger will in fact be approved by all jurisdictions and what it might look like if it does. So if we don't begin addressing the cost allocation issues now, we're just kicking the can down the road and losing valuable time. And as I've laid out in my testimony, the rate disparity between DEC and DEP is, in my opinion, is critical now, and it will only get worse. And we have to find a way to allocate these costs for the statewide carbon plan. It's not a DEP customer carbon plan that DEC customers get to piggyback on. That has to be addressed. And to wait 3, 4, 5 years to see what may or may not happen with the merger, I hope it does turn out to be a full merger. That's what I think, in my opinion, would be the best outcome, but we may not can rely on the best outcome. We need a plan now, and we need to start addressing these allocation issues now.
Have you given thought to how that might be done, cost allocation? As we wait for the eventual outcome on any merger or other consolidation proceedings?
Well, yes, I have given some thought to it. Some of the issues could and will get into not only legal issues, but potentially what are acceptable accounting issues, and those have to be resolved. I mean, if you just give me a magic wand and let me do it the way an engineer wants to do it, I can make it happen, but that may not be legal.
Well, no, you're
Or it
thinking
may
of a
not,
lawyer.
it may not,
Right.
it may not, meet Ms. Boswell's requirements for accounting practices. So
Okay.
I said I could make it happen. Mr. Metz could make it happen.
Okay.
I scared him when I said that I would do it.
Okay. Is there anything that you want the commission to direct? So let me back up. In my opinion, our order was clear that we wanted you all to get to work. What else could we say to the parties to impress upon them that this is an issue that they need to start working on?
I think possibly put a deadline on it. You want to see something firm by a certain date. Either you're going this way or you're going this way, and here is the path that you're going to take.
Okay. And is this, in seriousness, I mean, is this work that's better taken up in the context of a rate case, or is it better help me understand, and Ms. Boswell, you weigh in here too, because this is going to involve the accountants, but what is the appropriate forum for this work?
Let me say, and then I'll pass it over to Ms. Boswell, but I was hopeful that, and I still am, that it will be addressed in these upcoming DEP and DEC general rate cases. That is the place that it needs to be addressed. Now, I believe the DEP filing is going to occur on October 6th. That's about 2 weeks from now. It doesn't necessarily have to be addressed the day of the filing, but the clock will be ticking starting October 6th. So, and that is the forum, because once we, assuming we're going to have a multi-year rate plan, the commission is going to be setting rates and using a cost of service that will be in place for the next 3 years. So if we don't get it done in this case, then we're pushing it out to 23, 24, maybe 26 before we can. And all the while, we've got to do these red zone upgrades. A lot of those are taking place in the DEP territory. We don't have a way to allocate those. I think Ms. Bateman maybe characterized those costs as not that significant, but to me, anything is significant, and we don't know what the future holds. And I'm going to use my phrase, and some people have sort of stolen my thunder because they're going to think that I'm stealing their words, but hope is not a plan. I think it's the third time you've heard that. That's been on my whiteboard for years, so I think somebody sneaked into my office and stole that from me. But anyway, we need a plan in all seriousness. So I'll let Ms. Boswell comment.
I concur with Mr. McClawhorn. The faster that we get the faster we get together and determine the appropriate allocation, the less the ratepayers, especially in the DEP territory, will be held responsible for costs that they really shouldn't be bearing. And significance to one is entirely different than if I went and knocked on DEP ratepayers' doors and asked them if it was significant to them.
Okay. All right. Just making sure I don't have anything else for you all. Mr. McLaughlin, in your testimony, you also, you mentioned the comprehensive rate study,
Yes.
that work that you all have already undertaken, the companies have undertaken, and I think it's generally come to a conclusion. My anticipation is that it will inform, subsequent rate case filings. But give me your thoughts on how that work went and what your expectation is for the time and, for what's going to come out of the time and the resources you all expended there.
Of course, Mr. Floyd was the primary public staff person over that, and my conversations with him and my understanding is that he feels that it went well. That study was primarily to look at ways to make the rate structures between the two utilities more consistent, and that certainly is a step that, when I say the utilities, I mean DEC and DEP, and that's a step that has to be taken. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with aligning costs, but as they would be determined in a rate case class cost allocation study, jurisdictional. But that is a step that must be taken, and we will expect to see some of the fruits of that when the DEP rate case is filed in a couple of weeks.
Okay. Last question for you all, Mr. McLaughlin. I might direct it to you, and then Ms. Boswell, if you want to weigh in, you can. I think I have seen you all in this room for most, if not all, of the hearings so far. Is that correct? Or have you at least had it? If you haven't been in here, have you had a chance to listen? Okay. Is there anything have you heard anything of concern that you would like to comment on or that you would like to bring to the commission's attention? I'm giving you an open-ended question here to let us know if there are things you think we need to be paying attention to.
I think one area that I addressed in my testimony that has gotten a little bit of play, but maybe not that much, is the whole concept of lease cost. And I addressed that in one section of my testimony. So I just think I would urge the commission to continue to keep that in mind as you deliberate what the ultimate plan is going to be. The public staff's interpretation of lease cost has never been least bottom line cost. It has always been least or lowest reasonable cost, which considers some of the other factors that our panel one addressed, executability, reliability, and cost to ratepayers. That we all know that this changeover to the electrical system is significant. We have a law. The public staff is committed to seeing that carried out, but no one should be deceived into thinking that there's not going to be cost impacts to customers, and that's all classes of customers. And we've always had competitive rates in North Carolina. I've been with public staff for a long time, and I like to think that maybe I've had a small part to play in that, and I've always been proud of that we've had a robust economy and we've been able to attract good paying jobs, and I want to see that continue for the entire state, both DEC and DEP, as well as Dominion and all areas. I want the state of North Carolina to be able to flourish into the future. So I'll stop.
I concur with Mr. McLaughlin. As detailed in all of our testimonies, we are just looking for the best path forward, knowing that there are going to be costs associated with it, and being mindful of the balance between the costs that are being borne by the companies and the costs that need to be borne and the timeliness of those to the ratepayers.
All right, thank you both. Go ahead.
Apologize. I have one follow-up question. Mr. McLaughlin, in your exchange with Chair Mitchell about what the commission needs to do, you responded set firm deadlines and say, we're going down this path or we're going down this path. And I just want to explore that a little bit further. You mentioned that the appropriate forum, no matter which path you take, is the general rate case. But I just want to get some clarification on this path or this path. Do you mean by this date, you need to tell us you're going to merge the companies and we want this merger to happen before the rate case? Or are you saying, or the other option is that you're going to have a workable method to properly and appropriately allocate the cost between deck and depth to achieve the carbon plan?
Okay, I think I'll have to take that in parts. So we need a workable and reasonable way to allocate the cost between deck and depth. And we need to be able to do that before rates are set in these upcoming rate cases. That needs to be done regardless of whether there's a merger or not, in my opinion. I think that's where Ms. Bateman and I have some disagreement. She is focused on the merger, and let's go down that path and not worry about the cost allocation issue now, because once we merge, that will take care of itself. And I don't disagree with her that once we merge, then we'll just have one utility and we'll have one big pot of cost. But I am concerned we can't possibly merge by the time of the rate case or even by the end of the rate case, because I think the plan that Ms. Bateman and Mr. Peeler laid out in their joint testimony, I think had the merger maybe, I think it was around 2026. And I said that I thought that was a reasonable timeline. I have no idea whether that's will truly be possible or not. I mean, I looked at it and the steps that they had identified, and I said, well, that's reasonable, but it could take longer than that. I doubt seriously it would take less time than that. And the Duke will be incurring cost, and I believe significant cost before then. So we need to get the cost allocation issue, some type of mechanism for that before the rates are set in these upcoming rate cases. Did that?
That answered my question. Thank you.
All right, questions on commission's questions? Go ahead.
Mr. McLaughlin, Ms. Boswell, have either of you evaluated DEP's recent filing listing transmission projects in docket number E2 sub 1300?
I have looked at it. I can't talk about it with any detail.
Would you agree that that docket was opened for the purpose of deciding DEP's first performance-based regulation rate case in North Carolina?
Yes.
And it's true, is it not, that DEP is seeking to include certain costs for some RZEP projects for recovery in the multi-year rate plan that it will seek to have the commission approved in that docket? Is that right?
Yes, that's my understanding.
And those costs will be allocated according to a transmission allocation factor pursuant to the jurisdictional and customer class allocation methodologies approved by the commission in that rate case?
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
Questions from Duke?
Yeah, just a few.
Okay.
Thank you. So just want to follow up on a couple of questions from the commission on the merger and the steps that the companies and the public staff have been discussing with respect to addressing cost differences. So I think you would agree that the merger is the most direct and simplest way to deal with the forward-looking cost differences, correct?
That's the way I see it, yes.
Okay. And obviously you're aware the companies have identified that as their preferred and most direct route to solving these issues, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And And the companies have in fact put forward a timeline for achieving that merger. And I think you referenced that just a moment ago, and I'm assuming you're familiar with that timeline.
Yes, and I said that I thought it was reasonable.
Okay. And so under that timeline, the companies would be have targeted achievement of a completion of a merger, consummation of a merger by the beginning of 2027.
Yes.
Okay. And understanding there will be hurdles to be cleared to achieve that. If that happens, from that point forward, we'll have a solution, quote unquote, for the rate difference for new investments going forward.
For new investments going forward, yes, but not for the ones that will occur between now and then.
Okay.
And that's if the merger, in fact, is consummated in time by 2027.
Understood. And I'm assuming you've had a chance to review Ms. Bateman's testimony on rebuttal.
I did, yes.
Okay. And do you happen to have a copy of it with you? We can provide one, I think, if you don't have one.
Yes, I do.
Okay. Let me just paraphrase a part of what she said, and we can take you to the page if you need to. But do you recall that her testimony is that the carbon plan investments themselves are not materially or in most cases at all widening the rate differential through 2026, and she provided some analysis behind that statement. Do you recall that portion of testimony?
I generally recall it. Can you direct me?
Yeah, certainly. Page 6 of her rebuttal testimony. And the question starts on line 1. And the sort of heart of that statement is on beginning on line 21. It's page 6, line 21. And
Yes, I see that, and I recall that that's her testimony.
okay. And do you take any issue with the calculations that Ms. Bateman has provided there?
No, not necessarily, but I also know that that may not be the way the costs work out exactly as either. So,
okay, but you understand that her position is that based on her calculations, the carbon plan investments themselves don't actually contribute to further widening under most of these circumstances or any material amount of widening before the point in time at which the merger is targeted for consummation.
I understand that that's her testimony. I don't necessarily agree with that. I'm not taking issue with her calculation here, but I don't necessarily agree with her conclusion.
Okay. And appreciate that. And let me ask you a hypothetical, then I'll wrap up. So if Ms. Bateman's correct and the carbon plan doesn't drive any material widening of rate differences before the targeted time for completion of a merger, would you agree that would lessen the need to identify other alternative options for addressing rate differences that will be immediately not needed as soon as you have a merger in place?
I guess I would go back to my testimony that it is not a guarantee that the merger will take place. And I'm not in any way implying that Duke would not be earnestly pursuing the merger, but you have to, as I said earlier, you have to get approval not only from this commission, but from the South Carolina Public Service Commission as well as the FERC. And it will require approval from all 3 of those. And we don't know if you'll be able to get that. I hope you do. I know you hope you do, but we don't know that. And if we wait until 2026 or 2027 and find out you were at the last step and you've been turned down, then we're starting to get into more significant costs. I'm not going to say that I don't think the costs are significant between now and then, but they will certainly become more significant. And then we're having to start from scratch at that point.
But you would agree that when and if and when those more material rate differences start to develop post 2027 or post the end of 2026, looking in 2027, those will be subject to consideration in future rate cases in which the commission would have additional opportunities to consider those, resolving those issues.
Yes, and we don't know when that next rate case might be at that point in time. It could be, you could have just had one and it could be 3 more years. So we might be looking at 2030.
Okay.
We don't know. So as I said, we need a plan now.
And I would just like to add, keep in mind, any plant that you add between the rate cases would still be allocated at the previous rate case level. So if for whatever reason you didn't come back in at that point in time, those new costs would still be allocated at that old level, which presents a problem.
But not reflected in rates. If there was not an interim rate case, they wouldn't be reflected in rates.
Rates are supposed to be reflective of serving all of the customers based off of whatever it is that you put into service.
Okay. No further questions.
Public staff.
Just a couple of questions. Mr. McLaughlin and Ms. Boswell, the commission had told the public staff and Duke to get busy on working on the rate disparity issue. To address this, would the public staff consider making an adjustment to account for this allocation issue in the upcoming rate case?
That's possible. I believe I mentioned that in my testimony.
And they, Chair also asked about ways the commission could address this rate disparity. So your understanding is of the performance-based rate making, could the commission disallow any recovery of cost that should be allocated in this upcoming multi-year rate plan?
I believe the commission has the discretion to disallow any costs they find are not reasonable.
And is it your understanding under the performance-based rate making statute that the commission could even deny the multi-year rate plan and still go forward the general rate case?
That is my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
All right, at this point, I think there's nothing further for this panel. I'll entertain motions if necessary.
Chair Mitchell, the public staff would move that the testimony summaries of Michelle Boswell and James McLaughlin be moved into the record.
All right, they will be copied into the record at the appropriate time. Any additional motions for these witnesses? All right, you all may step down. Thank you very much for your testimony today, and you are excused. We're going to take a break for the court reporter for 5 minutes. We will be back on the we're off the record. We'll be back on the record at 3:37. Your right hands, left hands on the Bible. Do you swear testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All right, thank you. My name is Ben Smith, representing Avangrid Renewables, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. And this is the Avangrid Renewables panel that just got called and sworn in. Ms. Gallagher, would you please state your full name and business address for the record?
My name is Rebecca Gallagher. I go by Becky. The offshore wind business address for Avangrid Renewables LLC is 125 High Street, 6th floor, Boston, Mass. 02110.
And by whom are you employed and what capacity?
I'm employed by Avangrid and my role is director of the new business team for offshore wind.
Thank you, Ms. Gallagher. Can you please briefly describe your role and responsibilities with Avangrid Renewables?
Sure. The new business team focuses on the non-engineering scope of early stage business development for offshore wind. This covers market making in basically all forms throughout the Eastern Seaboard and in California as well, working with state policymakers and the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management in wind policy and lease proceedings, BOEM auction preparation and execution, stakeholder work, RFP responses, contract negotiation, partnerships, mergers, and acquisitions.
And just to clarify, I think you said Bureau of Offshore Energy Management. Did you mean offshore, or I'm sorry, ocean energy management?
I did. Thank you.
Dr. Sterrett, I'd like to turn to you. Would you please state your full name and business address for the record?
Yeah, my name is Michael Sterrett, and the offshore wind business address for Avangrid Renewables is 125 High Street, 6th floor, Boston.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
Yeah, my position at Avangrid Renewables is senior manager of the bid and value engineering department. My pleasure. My position at Avangrid Renewables is senior manager of the bid and value engineering department.
And Dr. Sterrett, can you please briefly describe your role and responsibilities with Avangrid Renewables?
Yeah, at Avangrid Renewables, the department that I'm responsible for, the department I lead is responsible for the business case and the overall commercial execution of our contracted portfolio. So in total, across the U.S., that's about 1/6 of everything that's under contract. My team and I are closely involved in the engineering, the contracting, the procurement of the full scope of equipment and services that are needed to construct and operate large-scale offshore wind projects. Benefiting from the deep understanding that we have on the project fundamentals and the value drivers earned through our overseeing of the business case for these projects, my team is continuously involved in our organic and inorganic growth through lease auctions, RFPs, and mergers and acquisitions.
Thank you. And Dr. Sterrett, since you agreed to be lead witness for this panel, I'm going to ask you, did the panel cause to be pre-filed in this docket direct testimony consisting of 25 pages?
Yes.
Do you have any changes you need to make to your panel's direct testimony at this point in time?
Yeah, I wanted to clarify for the commission a point on the $850 million CapEx equivalency that we described in our direct testimony. Duke claimed during its long lead direct testimony that this was a miscalculation, but in fact it was correct. And we want to add a clarifying remark. We stated in our direct testimony on page 23, line 5, the quote, put in terms of CapEx, based on a simple but reasonable financial equivalence of about 50 million per percent change in NCF.
Chair Mitchell, not to interrupt, but if this is, it sounds like it's for Sir rebuttal, but if it's additional language to add to your testimony, could we possibly go a bit slower so we could write it down?
I'd object to this being characterized as a rebuttal. This is responding to some question about whether Avangrid Renewables had done correct math in their direct testimony, but I will instruct my witnesses to slow down.
That is the nature of Sir rebuttal. But
So Mr. Smith, you don't have an opportunity to engage in direct examination here with your witness. That you may have an opportunity to engage with them on redirect.
Sure.
So unless there are corrections that need to be noted for purposes of the record, let's move forward.
All right, we'll save. All right, if I were to ask you the same questions today that appear in your pre-filed direct testimony, would the panel's answers be the same?
Yes.
And did you also cause to be pre-filed in docket 179A a summary of your direct testimony?
Yes.
And is the testimony set forth in your summary true and accurate to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
Chair Mitchell, at this time, I would ask that the direct testimony and summary of Ms. Becky Gallagher and Dr. Michael Sterrett be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
All right, motion's allowed.
At this time, Chair Mitchell, the panel of Ms. Becky Gallagher and Dr. Michael Sterrett is now available for questions from parties and the commission.
All right. Let's see, we've got Sigford.
Good afternoon. DC Canada in for Sigma 2 and 3. Hope you all are doing well. Ms. Gallagher, in your testimony on page 24, starting at line 1, I'll give you a moment to get there.
Okay,
You provide recommendations to the commission, is that right?
That's correct.
In those recommendations, you recommend that the commission initiate a study process to compare and prioritize regional offshore wind resources based on cost, efficiency, viability, COD schedule, correct?
That's correct.
Further elaborating on that recommendation. At line 7, you suggest that a bottom-up calculation of LCOE, PVRR, or similar metric be used for the comparisons. Is that right?
That's correct.
At this time, I'd like to introduce an exhibit. Chair Mitchell, I'd like this exhibit to be marked and identified as Sigfer Avangard Panel Direct Cross-Examination Exhibit 1, which I'll represent to be the EIA levelized costs of new generation resources in the annual energy outlook.
All right, the document will be marked as SIG for 2 and 3, Avangard Panel, Direct Cross-Examination Exhibit 1.
Dr. Sterrett, could you turn to page 9 of the document and look at table 1B?
I'm there.
All right, it shows the estimated unweighted levelized cost of electricity and levelized cost of storage for new resources entering service in 2027.
See it?
If you look at the last column for the dispatchable technologies and resource constrained technologies categories only, does offshore wind have the highest LCOE?
Yes.
What is the LCOE for offshore?
The LCOE for offshore that I'm reading in this table is 103.77, acknowledging that this is a public document, not something that I produced.
Absolutely. Could you now turn to page 22 of the document?
I don't have an objection, but I actually think did you say the total LCOE?
The total LCOE, you can include the tax credit, but my mistake on that.
Is it this
including
last
the
column?
tax credit. Yes, the last column.
Dr. Sterrett, would you mind reading the number for offshore on the total?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can
Chair
read.
Mitchell, I don't know that that's an objection. That is redirect. The witness answered the question.
Apologies, I'll stay for redirect.
Yeah. All right, now on page 22, for table B1B, this table shows the estimated unweighted levelized cost of electricity and levelized cost of storage for new resources entering a service in 2040. Again, if you look at the last column for the dispatchable technologies and resource constrained technologies only, does offshore wind have the highest LCOE?
As I read through the table, offshore wind has the highest LCOE. I would caveat it to say a few things. One, I don't know anything about the characteristics that are being described here, or I can't comment in any way on whether or not the capital costs are right. I also don't know what the financing is assumed, and I don't know anything about the tax credits. I also don't know in what way this would be considered, whether it's part of a PBRR or a portfolio where it's meeting to fit in. But to your specific question, is the highest LCOE in this table?
Thank you. That's all.
All right. Let's see. Tech customers. All right. Thank you, Ms. Shower. Walmart, you're up.
thank you, Chair Mitchell. Good afternoon. My name is Carrie Grunman on behalf of Walmart. Let's go back to page 24 of your direct testimony with respect to the final recommendations to the commission. Were you all in the room this morning when counsel for the company was discussing with with the public staff potential issues with a third-party mandated study of the 3 offshore wind parcels?
Yes, I was.
If the commission were to direct such a third-party independent study of the 3 offshore wind parcels located off the coast of North Carolina, would Avangrid intend to participate in such a study?
Yes.
Turning to page 14 of your testimony, I don't believe you were in the room, but curious if you may have been following along to the live stream when the company's long lead time resources panel was testifying. Were you all watching that testimony?
At least a part of it.
Did you recall that there was some apparent, I guess I would describe it as confusion, but the company didn't seem to know for sure whether Avangrid would be open to selling the Kitty Hawk parcel to the company. So I want to discuss that with you. And it sort of calls upon the question and answer beginning on line 3 on page 14 of your testimony. Is Avangrid sitting here today willing to discuss with the company the sale of its Kitty Hawk offshore wind lease to the company?
Yes.
Does Avangrid believe that it would be helpful in terms of any such negotiation for the commission to resolve the legal question described, I think, in your brief at lines 11 to 13 on the legal issue of third-party ownership?
Yes.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that I have.
One moment, Commissioners. Thank you. No questions.
All right. All right, Duke Energy.
No questions.
All right, let me check in with commissioners. Commissioner Clodfelter. Oh, I'm sorry. Redirect. I'm sorry. Mr. Smith, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. I believe there's just one thing that's within the scope of redirect. Going back to that LCOE chart in, let's see if I can say this. Sigford 2 and 3 Avangrid Renewables witness Starrett and Gallagher direct cross-examination exhibit 1. Do you have that?
Yes.
And would you mind stating the correct total LCOE for wind offshore located on page 9?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I had stated 103.77. In this table, it's 105.38. And I just want to expand a bit more on the statement that I had made, especially as it relates to cost, especially when you're thinking about renewable systems. We are very comfortable and familiar in general with costs, thinking about them on just a dispatch basis. Whenever it is you start to get into higher renewables systems, you will always have the lowest cost, being very likely desert solar across the country. And you need to work your way up the merit order dispatch always. I'm not suggesting that this number to me is not familiar to me at all. Doesn't ring a bell in any way. But it should be the case that whenever it is you're thinking about LCOEs, you're thinking about in the context of the fit to the portfolio and what it brings to the overall system. So while I acknowledge that offshore wind is the highest in this table, I would disagree that it's the least economic resource for any portfolio.
Thank you. Nothing further.
All right, Commissioner Clodfelter.
Dr. Sterrett, were you listening to the testimony of the Duke Long Lead Time Resource Panel when Mr. Pompey accused Avangrid of a $500 million mathematical error in its direct testimony?
Yes, I was.
Do you have a response to that accusation?
Yes, I was, and thank you very much for the opportunity to clarify that. In the renewables development business, it's quite common to think in terms of percent change rather than percent, and that's because your starting point matters a lot. So when we're representing the LCOE of the Carolina Long Bay and Kitty Hawk lease areas as 36 and 43% respectively, that differential change, right, the relative change between 36 and 43% is a 20% improvement, okay? So when I'm talking here about $50 million per percent change, that's the relative percent change, that's 20%. 20 times 50 is somewhere in the ballpark of 850 million, all those being rounded. Right? I said it's about 50 million per percent. It's about 20%. So if you get down into the details of the math, that's what it would be. Is that clarifying?
Thank you for the answer.
Additional questions from commissioners? Go ahead.
I have a question in regard to page 21, and it looks like beginning on line 17 and 18, dealing with the statement about capital costs and that the Kitty Hawk and Carolina Long Bay lease areas would be basically equivalent if they were right size at approximately 1,300 megawatts and face the same network upgrade costs. I think we heard something a little bit different about the network upgrade costs from the Duke witness panel. Can you explain what studies you're relying upon about those network upgrades costs being roughly equivalent?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I want to just, the extent that it's acceptable to the commission, I want to maybe just take a little bit to elaborate on this in concept, because sometimes I think it can be helpful just to take a step back. Whenever it is that you have an offshore wind project, and we've looked at, bid, and are developing a lot of them, whenever it is you have one and you're more than about 100 kilometers from wherever you're going to make landfall, you're probably going to buy an HVDC solution. That's about the break-even point. So from that perspective, with both Carolina Long Bay and the Kitty Hawk lease area both being 100 kilometers away, they would be both seeking to interconnect at whatever the best opportunity is, both using HVDC. So want to just sort of put it initially to say they're probably both looking for the best point of interconnection. Our disagreement and the way in which we challenge the point of interconnection in here is not to say that we think that the company's identified point of interconnection of New Bern is the wrong interconnection point. Actually, we acknowledge fully that it's a strong point of interconnection. Our disagreement is actually a little bit simpler. It's more around how the resource is being considered from a modeling perspective. So here's what I mean by that. Usually when you're building a portfolio expansion model like Encompass, you have tranches for a reason. So you would have, if you were doing this and you're trying to build the first most efficient offshore wind project that you possibly could, you would find the lowest cost grid upgrades that you possibly could. To the extent that there's more appetite in the model for something additional to that, you would test the model, but show it the extra cost of that. So when I'm challenging the interconnection solution proposed by the companies, where both the first 800 and then the second 800 are both working their way towards New Bern and then triggering large scale upgrades there, I'm not disagreeing that New Bern is not a good point of interconnection or a strong point of interconnection. It's a point of interconnection that's available to both of the resources. Oh, yep, not all. I get that quite a lot. It's available, a point of interconnection that's available to both of the resources. And it might be the right choice depending on your appetite, the model's appetite, what it's putting forward. What we were challenging in our testimony is just simply that if you were trying to build that first tranche in the model as low cost as you possibly could, you would have looked at other solutions. That's the challenge that we have there from interconnection. We also made statements about them being of equivalent cost, which I'm happy to expand on. But since your question was just limited to the transmission, I'll pause to see if you have an interest in further comment.
Right. My question was just specific to the network upgrades, because I think that was a criteria that Duke used to differentiate the cost between the two projects.
I don't recall that Duke differentiated the cost between the Carolina Long Bay and Kitty Hawk lease areas by upgrades. I think the differentiation that they were really trying to make was on the export cable length. And here I'm happy to speak to that. So when you have an offshore project, you will always be buying cabling from the offshore substation to the landfall, which will be submarine cable that's buried usually about 1.5 meters below the seabed. You'll land, and then you'll take whatever your onshore route is to whatever your point of interconnection is. So just initially, maybe we can allow that for whatever the point of interconnection is, whatever's happening onshore will be the same once they make landfall. I think the point that Duke was seeking to raise was really specifically around the length of the route to get there, with the argument that the Carolina Long Bay is closer from their perspective. I would challenge that from two perspectives. The first is, in our limited comments, we put forward an offshore export cable route and identified the cable lengths associated with it, both from our lease area and from Carolina Long Bay. We had them as being about 25 kilometers different. And I indicated in my direct testimony that from our assessment, and we procured more than $1 billion of offshore cables, it's not a material cost. 25 kilometers of offshore cable is not a big deal, right? And I can tell you that just to put some precision on that, it's about $1 million per kilometer. So for 25 kilometers, you're at $25 million. It's a lot of money for some things, but it's not a lot of money for a big giant 1.3 gigawatt project. Duke further challenged that the cabling corridor that we had identified would not have been acceptable for permitting. And there, what I can say is Avangrid Renewables has about 175 people in the US. Our development team is, actually look this up, our development team is 21, our development permitting team has 21 staff members as of today. Our engineering team has 41, and our construction team has 26 people. That team, the director level people from each of those teams have been to North Carolina, evaluating that offshore export cable corridor. And we were specifically guided as a preference to there by the National Park Service and the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Just a few questions. Do I understand correctly that the Kitty Hawk lease has two sections? There's north and south.
I'll just try to be as super clear as I possibly can. Whenever it is you buy a lease area, you submit a COP, right? That's your construction operations plan. You designate within that the area that you're talking about. We have differentiated. We've submitted two COPs for Kitty Hawk. One is we call Kitty Hawk North, which is a certain number of positions, and it goes, as Duke was pointing out, its current interconnection route is to to Virginia, although we could change that at any time. The second one, which is called Kitty Hawk South, is a separate COP that we had filed, and that is still open to where it's going. Just to give a scale of that, the capacities of the total zone is about 3.5 gigawatts, more or less. 2/3 of that is in Kitty Hawk South. So in this, I think it's important to note that although we're always comparing Carolina Long Bay, Kitty Hawk South, or Kitty Hawk, when we're saying Kitty Hawk South, and I think when most people are saying it here, they're talking about that bottom 2/3, which is roughly 150% bigger than either of the Carolina Long Bay lease areas individually. Is that helpful?
And what do you mean when you say bigger?
I have it in acres or in positions, but it's about the Carolina Long. So all right, so just to not get into too much of the jargon, we think in terms of positions, which is just a place in the ocean that you could put a wind turbine. We do that because wind turbine capacities are growing so quickly that if you try to say it in megawatts, you'll be wrong within a year. So the Kitty Hawk lease area, Kitty Hawk South, has 120 wind turbine positions, more or less. So you could call that about 2.5 gigawatts of capacity. The Carolina Long Bay lease area, from our perspective, and we have a talented team, we looked at Carolina Long Bay, we had considered the participating lease area, so we did a lot of diligence on it. The Duke, I don't have the acronym, the Duke Renewable Zones, 546, we have that as being at a most 90 positions, and our own risk assessment, you could take what you want about the 24 nautical mile buffer. We took it seriously. It would put you down to 46 positions. So when I say bigger, I mean 121 positions up in Kitty Hawk South, not more than 90, and somewhere between 90 and 46 as a more likely base case for the Carolina Long Bay lease area owned by Duke Renewables.
Okay. And at this point in time, has an interconnection request been submitted either to PJM or into DEP for either of the lease areas?
Kitty Hawk North has an interconnection request filed. We filed it pretty close to when we were really kicking off with that zone for a total of 2.4 gigawatts, which I just mentioned we think there's 3.5 in there, which just reflects how capacities have grown. We have not filed anything into Duke. We have in Q1 of 23, our development team is going to be coming down to North Carolina to meet with some of the towns that we are considering making landfall at to help us to mature our understanding both of where we would landfall, where we would make landfall, and then where we file interconnection to. I would say overall, what Kitty Hawk South needs is clarity of where to go. When Kitty Hawk South has clarity of where to go, we'll file an interconnection request.
Okay. Is it possible that the leases could be combined into one point of interconnection such that if you were able to proceed through the PJMQ, you could proceed with the entire lease area? I see you're shaking your head. So is that a yes?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why in our testimony, we didn't split hairs between Kitty Hawk North and Kitty
Okay.
Hawk South. Yes, it's true, they have separate COPs, but it's also true that the entire zone could deliver to North Carolina with, revision of the COP. That's not a big deal.
Similarly, it could go to PJM. The
Correct.
entirety. Okay. 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 The last question, the conversations about that you just indicated you all are gonna have with local communities or authorities about coming onshore. Are you anticipating being able to interconnect with something with a utility other than DEP?
No, sorry, but yeah, just to clarify that, whenever it is you interconnect, you'll usually have to file and negotiate with the town a host community agreement in order to travel to the roadways and et cetera. We've done this a couple of different times. So as an example, when we were looking at the Carolina Long Bay lease areas, we had thought about, well, what are the communities? What are their oppositions? Is this a place that you would ever make landfall? You're thinking of all kinds of things. It's the same story here. When our team had come down previously, we met with, as I said, we met with the Department of Transportation to understand their interest in our ability to travel on the roadways. We met with just, the National Forest Service about traveling through the forest there and so on. So our trip down here is really just about getting feedback from the communities about where a potential landfall might make the most sense for the communities that are available there. It's always anticipated that an interconnection in DP is what we would target in North Carolina.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. Let's see if there are questions on commissioners' questions. We'll start with, let's see. Let's start with the interveners.
No questions.
Okay.
I do
Go
have a
ahead.
few.
Go
Thank
ahead.
you, Chair Mitchell. Good afternoon. My name is Vishwal Lake. I'm here for Duke Energy. Wanted to first discuss with you the routing of the subsea cable. And I believe you mentioned an exhibit that was to your limited comments. And if you have those there?
Mhm.
Are you talking about page 42? And is it figure 3-4, potential interconnection routing from the Kitty Hawk wind lease? It's the last page of of those comments, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, well, we have it here. Mhm.
Okay.
Yes.
And in those comments, you have a table 3-2 summary of cable route lengths. And it states for the New Bern 230 kV point of interconnection, the cable route length to Kitty Hawk in kilometers is 266 kilometers. That's correct?
That's correct.
And then you state the estimated cable route length to a Carolina Long Bay lease is 248 kilometers, correct?
That's correct.
And that's where you're getting your differential of 25 kilometers?
That's correct.
Okay, and if we're looking at the map, that's a little bit above the table 3-2, the figure 3-4, the route that is shorter, that's going through the Pamlico Sound, correct?
That's correct.
And that's the route that you said you said two organizations
Yeah.
have supported?
The National Park Service and also the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries suggested that as a potential preferred route. Of course, permitting could take you all kinds of directions, but that's what we're starting with.
All right. Let's move to a discussion you had, I believe, with Chair Mitchell about if you wanted to change the point of interconnection with Kitty Hawk North or Kitty Hawk South. I believe you said you could change it at any time, no big deal.
Well, we don't do development. They say everything that we propose is a big deal. But what I should maybe clarify is to say it is absolutely within the ability of your team to either amend your COP both before and after the record of decision.
So if right now you are before the record of decision in both the Kitty Hawk North and Kitty Hawk South BOEM process, correct?
That's correct. Both are filed, both are in process. Both will have record of decision in the middle of this decade.
All right. And if you amend your COP, to change your point of interconnection, don't you start over at the BOEM process?
No, you don't.
Right. So when you said both are expecting a record of decision by, you said the end of this decade?
The middle of this decade.
By the middle of the decade, but they have different timings, correct?
That's correct.
And what is the timing for the record of decision in Kitty Hawk North?
The timing of the record decision for Kitty Hawk North, I believe we're currently you could check it on the permitting dashboard. We have it. The permitting dashboard is estimating it in 2026.
For Kitty Hawk
Is
North?
this for Kitty Hawk North?
South.
She's asking about Kitty Hawk
Oh,
North.
sorry.
I don't recall what, it is available on the BOEM permitting dashboard. I don't recall for Kitty Hawk North.
Chair Mitchell, just for clarity of the record, I do have two very quick exhibits from the BOEM website, north and south. May I hand those out?
Chair, I'd like to put in an objection. I feel like this is outside of the scope of the commissioner's questions.
I believe it's well within the scope. You asked about north and south, you asked about permitting, you asked about whether it could go to PJM or both go to North Carolina.
I'll allow it. Overrule the objection.
It's the other one.
I don't know. I think,
All right, let's go ahead and mark the first document.
Chair Mitchell, they look a little identical, so let's try the Kitty Hawk North Wind Project. It's sort of the
You say
title.
north?
North.
Okay, okay.
Duke Energy Avangrid Direct Cross-Examination Exhibit 1, please.
Okay.
Thank you, Sal.
Document will be so marked.
I only have 2 copies of, okay.
They look very similar, but one says north, one says south.
I'm good.
Just moving along.
And
Let's mark the second one.
May we mark the Kitty Hawk South Offshore Wind Project? Actually, it says DEC, DEP. Let's say Duke Energy, Avangrid, Direct Cross-Examination Exhibit 2.
It will be so marked.
Thank you.
Can you confirm, we marked north as exhibit 1 and
That's
south
correct.
as exhibit, thank
That's
you.
correct. North is 1, south is 2.
They
I
look
still
so
only have the
similar.
north.
And we
Okay.
need south.
May we have the South document handed to the witnesses, please?
I got it.
We can do this. We can do it. Get there.
South.
All right. Does everyone have a north and a south?
I only have south.
All right.
Okay. Everybody just come to order. Please pass out north so these people get north. Who does not have 2 documents? Raise your hand. Not you. Who does not? Right. All right. Ms. Link, you can please proceed.
Thank you. All right. So the Kitty Hawk North Wind Project is cross-examination exhibit 1, and the Kitty Hawk South is cross-examination exhibit 2, just to keep them straight for the record. So just to walk through the North document. That in the description, it says in June 2022, the project name was changed from Kitty Hawk Wind Project to Kitty Hawk North Wind Project. Do you see that? To reflect the segmenting of the project. And this is the north parcel is the one, if you turn it over, actually, excuse me, it's going to interconnect into Virginia Beach, correct?
That's where it's OECC, it's Offshore Export Cable Corridor is currently designated. That's correct.
And that's in the PJMQ, correct?
That's correct.
And that's the PJMQ that's been halted and it's being restudied.
I wouldn't use the characterization halted, but there's a pretty significant change in how they're processing, moving to a cluster study
Okay.
concept.
How long has that been pending in the PJMQ?
I don't recall the date that we filed that. Maybe I don't recall.
Okay. If you turn to the back page and you see the second bar, constructions and operations plan, when does that say that the Kitty Hawk North parcel is expected to get its COP?
Well, its COP was filed last year, May of last year, something like that. It doesn't, so just for the avoidance of doubt, this doesn't give a word on it that says ROD, but the COP.
Record of
I think your
decision.
question might be,
When is the record of decision expected in the COP for Kitty Hawk North?
I want to answer your question, but I want to answer it in the specific way that you're asking it. And on this page, I don't see any marker that you might be referring to with respect to ROD. Are you referring to any marker in particular on this page?
I would ask you as the expert, when do you expect the record of decision for Kitty Hawk
Is
North?
that related to the document that you filed in here, or is there something specific that you're looking at?
I'm looking at the back page of Kitty Hawk North. And it says that the construction and operations plan has the end of the bar at April of 2023. Is that when you expect the record of decision?
Oh, I see. I understand your question. The process is a little bit different when you're going through it. So just to put it in big blocks, you have a SAP, which we've talked about quite a lot. You will prepare a COP that will maybe take 2 to 3 years. You will submit the COP. BOEM will review it for a period of time. BOEM will issue an NOI, which is a notice of intent. From a notice of intent to a approval of the COP is usually 2 years. And after approval of the COP, a month or two later, a couple months later, you'll have a record of decision. I don't see the deadline here for record of decision. And as I stated earlier, I don't recall what the absolute latest indication from BOEM was, and I don't see it here to refresh myself to be able to make a statement about it.
So does the April of 2023, where the second bar ends, is that the approval of the COP?
It seems like a reasonable guess, but as I said, I don't recall. I'm not sure.
So it's your
Objection asked and answered.
I didn't ask a question yet.
Finish your question then.
My question is there nowhere on this bar chart where you can surmise where a record of decision would be from your experience?
Looking at the piece of paper that you printed and handed to me, I do not see the word ROD. I would remind that we have a team of 21 people in permitting and development at our business, and would just simply say that as it relates to the anticipated ROD for Kitty Hawk North, I don't recall.
Okay, so let's go to Kitty Hawk South then.
Your Honor, real quickly, I just have some concerns about this document. If you look at the back of the page, up at the top where the bars are, you can see that there's the beginning of a word.
Yeah.
After April, it goes A something. So I've actually pulled it up on my phone, and there does appear to be more dates. So I have some concern that the printout itself didn't accurately print. Like, it's one of those situations wherever it's formatted on the web page, it didn't print accurately. And so what I see when I look on the internet, on the website used on the bottom of this page, and what's on the back of this page don't perfectly match up. And so I just.
I'm
with you. Let me let Duke respond.
Yes,
Go
Chair
ahead.
Mitchell, it's a fair point, and I noticed that as well. The only questions I had are about the construction operation plan bar, which does have an end point of April of 2023, and I'm sure on the internet it matches. And so we can absolutely supplement for the record something that prints it all the way out with the other dates.
Okay, well, I would like you to do that.
Absolutely.
So when you make the filings and y'all
Absolutely.
indicate which is the sort of the supplemental or whatever we're going to call it, the revised exhibit.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Please
Absolutely will do
proceed.
so. My apologies. So moving now to cross-examination exhibit 2, which is the south parcel. Again, it indicates in June of 2022, the project name was changed from Kitty Hawk Wind Project to Kitty Hawk South Wind Project to reflect the segmenting. Do you see that?
Yes, that's correct. I do see that. Yes.
Okay. And this also says, and it's in the third paragraph under description, that the offshore export cable will traverse both federal waters and state territorial waters of Virginia and North Carolina, and could have landfall in either the city of Virginia Beach, Virginia, Dare County, North Carolina, Carteret County, North Carolina, and Craven County, North Carolina. And Craven County is where New Bern is, correct?
I'm sorry. Could you reorient me to this? I'm not sure if I see.
Sure.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Turn the page. Yeah, I see that. Yeah.
Okay, so Craven County, North Carolina is New Bern, correct?
I'm not, county names is not a I'll take your word for it.
All right, subject to check. And this COP was submitted to BOEM on April 14th, 2022, correct? It's
Yes,
right there.
I believe that's correct, yes.
Okay. And subject to the same critique Ms. Grunman had, and we will correct it for when we file with the commission. But I'm only focused then on the permitting timetable bar, second bar of the constructions and operations plan. And that shows that COP approval a little around May of 2025, correct?
Stating again, it concludes in May of 2025. I think it's probably easier to think of it more like this. BOEM, it's not binding, but the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has a commitment, again, it's not binding, of NOI, notice of intent, to ROD of 2 years. So we have NOI for Kitty Hawk North, I believe, and Kitty Hawk South is awaiting NOI. Once Kitty Hawk South has NOI, we would anticipate 2 years from that to have ROD. So why don't we have NOI yet? One of the reasons is just simply that we need to be absolutely confident about where it is that we should take the project. In the event that we have ROD, for example, for Kitty Hawk North, as you were pointing out, and we choose subsequent to that to go somewhere else, we could not restart the COP, but make an amendment. I don't have the specifics of that action, but when I brought it up for other lease areas with our development team, they've typically told me 18 months is about the right amount of time to consider a major amendment taking place.
So if you were to amend Kitty Hawk North to bring it down to North Carolina, and submitted an amendment to the COP, it would take 18 months for a record of decision after that?
Kitty Hawk North could take it, and subject to check, I believe that the amendment would impact only that export cable corridor. So you would be able to have, it'd be pending, so you'd be able to do the offshore works and just would simply not be able to lay your cable. And that would make sense. So you wouldn't be able to lay your cable until that particular segment is approved through the amendment. That's probably fine because cable laying comes in, if you were just to target a 2030 COD, it'd be well after 2027.
Okay, but the point is if you amended your COP, it's 18 months for it to be approved by
And
BOEM.
very important to consider why COPs and RODs matter. You would not be able to get
Chair
financing.
Mitchell, may I ask him to answer the question? It's a simple question. I just wanted to confirm it's 18 months after you amend the COP to get it approved by BOEM.
The very narrow portion that you're amending could take 12 to 18 months is what our development team tells us.
Okay.
Acknowledging for the record that you can do all works in all other parts of the COP, which have already been approved, which you're not amending, which would be everything in the offshore lease area.
Okay. So I just want to turn very briefly then to your figure 3 and your testimony. It's page 19. And so that figure 3 is intending to show the Kitty Hawk current status versus Carolina Long Bay lease areas status, and as it relates to the BOEM process, correct? Okay. And so that has a win lease auction, then 1.5 years, submit a COP, then 3 more years, and then receive, you're calling it the ROD, the record of decision and start construction. You see that?
Correct.
Okay. And then it said there's an arrow for Kitty Hawk, and it says Kitty Hawk is near the tail end of that 3 years.
Yeah, owing to the flexibility of the lease area being in total 177 positions, we thought it reasonable to represent either of a best case. It really just depends on what the preference is. So I would say it is fair that Kitty Hawk is represented as advanced in the permitting, acknowledging that we have 2 COPs submitted and that we have flexibility in what we do with either of those 2 lease areas.
All right. So you won the Kitty Hawk lease in 2017, correct?
That seems correct.
Okay. So if I take 1.5 years plus 3 years, that's 4.5 years. Correct? It's lawyer math.
Yep.
It's late on a Friday. So 2017 plus 4.5 years, that's the middle of 2021, correct? To finish to receive the record of decision. Am I reading the chart right?
I'm sorry, which chart are we on now?
Figure 3. Page
On page,
19.
page 19.
In general, if you had absolute certainty on your, just to be clear, in general, if you had absolute certainty on your path to market, it would be reasonable to assume a more aggressive COP to ROD timeline. That is true. It is, but I want to be extremely clear about this. It is reasonable relative to assume that you can achieve the best case with BOEM. As opposed to when you're still searching for offtake and you have less certainty, it's possible that it may not be as quick.
I appreciate that. So 2017 plus four and a
Mayor,
half.
I'm going to have to object. I feel like I don't recall commissioners' questions going this detailed into the timing of the different issues related to the wind lease areas. If I'm misremembering, fair enough, but I do not recall that.
Chair Mitchell, I thought it important to have on the record the timing for the COP for both Kitty Hawk North and Kitty Hawk South. The witness had stated he didn't know, and you could check the website. So we've gone through now, we have the website. Then I thought there is a figure in here that indicates that by mid-2021, Kitty Hawk should receive the record of decision. And it's clear from both these documents that that will not be so. So I just wanted to understand what figure 3 is supposed to be.
And I'll just restate, I feel like this is very far astray of what any of the commissioners asked.
All right. I'm going to overrule the objection. I'll let you ask one last question, and then hopefully you'll be finished.
Thank you. So for the Kitty Hawk South,
Hope is my plan right now.
I will come through for you. For the Kitty Hawk South parcel, with a approval of the construction and operations plan in May of 2025, isn't that 8 years from when the Kitty Hawk lease was won at auction?
It has been the intention of Avangrid Renewables to advance very quickly the Kitty Hawk North lease area. We submitted a materially complete COP that had all of the sort of both recon and detailed surveys had already been completed for that lease area. There are a lot of preferences that you could make. So the reason that Kitty Hawk North is more advanced is a strategic choice by us to get that site more advanced more quickly. The Kitty Hawk South site has benefited significantly from that work, not only because some of the surveys continued onto that lease area, but also because since we had done really detailed survey work, soils, et cetera, in Kitty Hawk North, we were able to build a full ground model for the whole area. We were able to build foundation designs and et cetera, that benefit both lease areas. I can say, just for the avoidance of doubt, because I'm not quite sure really what your question is, the COP has been submitted for Kitty Hawk South. We are awaiting NOI. We're anticipating it soon. Whenever it is that we get NOI, BOEM has a commitment, it's non-binding, of 2 years from NOI to ROD.
Chair Mitchell, I don't believe I got an answer to my question, but I don't need to ask any more questions.
All right. With that, I believe, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Smith.
I just have one
Okay, go ahead.
question.
Go ahead.
Can you very briefly explain to me the difference in permitting statuses between the 3 offshore wind lease areas off of North Carolina?
Yeah, thanks. So Kitty Hawk, both north and south, are significantly more advanced than either of the Carolina Long Bay lease areas, which were only just won this past May. Kitty Hawk has submitted both of its COPs for the north and the south. We're materially more advanced, having purchased that lease area in 2017.
Thank you. Nothing further.
All right. With that, I will take motions.
I'd like to move that the pre-filed summary of the panel be entered in the record.
All right. The summary of the pre-filed testimony of the witnesses will be copied in the record as if
Yes.
given orally from the stand at the appropriate time.
And then I would like, I would like my witnesses to be excused, but I know that we have to get more.
Okay. Let me take motions.
May we move the admission of Duke Energy Avangrid direct cross-examination exhibits 1 and 2?
All right, hearing no objection, motion's
Oh,
allowed.
and subject to being
They'll be supplemented,
supplemented.
correct, with the correct versions or with the complete
Complete
versions.
version. Thank you.
Chair Mitchell, I'd like to move that Sigfer Avangrid panel direct cross-examination exhibit 1 be admitted into the record at the appropriate time.
All right, hearing no objection, your motion's allowed. All right, you all may step down and be excused. Thank you very much for your testimony today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Neal.
Yeah, Chairman, so at this time, Southern Alliance of Clean Energy et al. And the jointly with the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association would call Uday Varadarajan to the stand.
All right, good afternoon. Do you prefer to be sworn or affirmed? Okay, raise your right hand. There you go. You swear testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
All right.
Please state your name, title, and business address for the record.
Uday Varadarajan. I'm a principal at RMI and a pre-court scholar at Stanford. My business address is 1111 Broadway in Oakland, California.
And please briefly describe your role and responsibilities at RMI.
I lead the utility transition finance team at RMI.
Mr. Varadarajan, did you cause to be pre-filed in this docket on September 2nd direct testimony consisting of 20 pages?
I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony at this time?
I do not.
If the questions put to you in your testimony were asked at the hearing today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Do you have any exhibits to your testimony?
Yes, I do.
And were those prepared by you or under your direction?
Yes, they were.
And did you prepare a summary of your testimony?
I did.
Chair Mitchell, I'd move to have Mr. Varadarajan's pre-filed direct testimony and summary entered into the record as though given orally from the stand, and to have the exhibits attached to his pre-filed direct testimony identified as pre-filed.
Hearing no objection, your motion's allowed.
The witness is available for cross-examination and questions from the commission.
All right, my notes indicate that we have up first, Sigfer.
Chair Mitchell, we'd waive.
Okay, let's see, Brad Rouse. Mr.
Okay,
Rouse.
yeah, hi, I'm Brad Rouse and I am pro se. I am an intervener and I am not a lawyer. So take that as you will. I just want to refer you to your testimony, page 19, the paragraph beginning with residential customers. And I'd be happy if you wanted to read, or I could read it. Just the first sentence.
Apologies, page 19.
That's what I've got here. Let me read it, and you can say, it says, residential customers see a 22% decrease in bills by 2030 compared with 22 in the optimized scenario, a 25% decrease over this period in the regional resources scenario compared with a 16% decrease in the Duke resources scenario. Is that your testimony?
That's correct, except I don't think I see the same page number, but that's
okay. And so my first question with respect to that is, did you assume in this analysis, well, I understand you used the Optimus modeling system. Is that correct?
That's
All right, let's get on the same page here so that we can get through this examination efficiently. I believe you're referring to page 19 of the witness's, the exhibit to his testimony. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think so. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Okay, just want to make sure the witness is able to answer your questions. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, so I've just got some questions about how you set up the analysis that was done. And one question is, first of all, this is a projection of the rates, all-in costs included.
That's correct.
Okay. And did you assume an underlying inflation rate?
Yes, there were underlying inflation rates that were built into the modeling. That's correct.
So was there an overall underlying inflation rate or a general consumer price index inflation rate that was assumed?
Yes, we used a projected CPI inflation rate based on inflation expectation taken from Treasury TIPS bonds.
So would it be fair to say that the real reductions in costs that you're expecting under this scenario, these three scenarios from 2022 are actually greater than the numbers? If you were to say that in constant dollars?
That's right, though, of course, the inflation expectations and analysis are dated now already.
Oh, tell me about how it's changed.
Only that inflation expectations have been moving very rapidly over the last few months. So relative to when the testimony was filed, they may have also already changed significantly.
Okay.
But the conclusion still holds.
Okay. Now, in your the way you refer to this in the sentence that I read, you referred to bills. Is that correct?
That's right. So the more appropriate statement is that we do include the impact of changes in expected load profile as well. That is the efficiency gains and the differences in load profile between the three different scenarios is accounted for. So we are looking at all-in bills on average rather than just rates. So that's a more precise way to say what that number really is.
So do you recall offhand, or could you tell me how much the decline was in energy consumption per customer over that period of time?
So this is just the difference between the Synapse assumptions and the assumptions that Duke used. So this is the 1.5% relative to the 1%.
For the Duke programs, but did you have an underlying decrease in usage per customer as well?
I believe that and I'll need to check this and revise potentially, but I believe this was an assumption that we made for the full load reduction, if I recall correctly.
But is it fair to say that you started with the Duke forecast?
We started with the Duke forecast, and there was a more aggressive assumption in the Synapse analysis. Yeah.
Okay. So you would have the Duke assumptions then on beneficial electrification and electric vehicles and net metering embedded in home solar production embedded in all of that?
That's right.
Okay. Do you have Duke's carbon plan summary available?
That I do not. Apologies.
Could I show him exhibit 1 of the executive, or table 1 of the executive summary of the carbon plan?
You may approach.
Is that okay?
I'll take it.
Okay. Oh, I don't have that in front of me now. In that, it shows the differential impacts of the portfolios from Duke. Is that correct? And
right.
There's a second section about affordability and impact on bills. Do you see that section there?
Mm-hmm.
And do you see the section where it says that in portfolio 1, the bill for residential customers using 1,000 kilowatt hours will go up by $35 in DEP and $8 in DEC. Do you see that?
I do.
So would you agree that portfolio 1 from Duke, from this executive summary, and the Duke resources scenario that you're referring to from Synapse have the same resource expansion schedule and underlying energy forecast?
Yes, they attempted to get as close as they could. This is based on Synapse's run of Duke's portfolio, and there are some important differences that I'm happy to get into.
So briefly, how can you reconcile that increase in bills with your 16% decrease in bills?
This is because we used an updated fuel price forecast for 2022 based on the geopolitical events that significantly shifted near-term gas price expectations and costs for this year. So the reductions are reflective of the fuel price shock that we're seeing in a way that wasn't possible for Duke to have done in its previous analyses. This is just a function of us having started the analysis later. That's why we really focus on the comparison between the scenarios rather than the absolute, But this is once we updated those cost forecasts, this is the result.
Okay. Well, would this also reflect the heightened, theirs is a 1,000 kilowatt hour fixed consumption, whereas you're looking at declining consumption also?
So theirs is normalized to reflect 1,000 kilowatt hours of consumption. It does indeed matter that the average customer would indeed be using less. But again, it's a relatively smaller effect, but we do see an impact from going from rates to bills.
And are you aware that both the Duke plan referenced in Portfolio 1 and the Duke Resources plan and the other two plans that you also discussed that having greater cost reductions do in fact all meet the 70% carbon reduction target in 2030?
Yes.
So would you say that there's load shock involved in meeting that target? Rate shock involved in meeting that target?
So we also do look by customer class at the impacts, and across the utility subsidiaries, and the specific rate impacts or bill impacts for customers do vary across rate classes and across the two subsidiaries. In some cases, for some customer classes, particularly as we look at the regional resources scenario or the optimized scenario, what we find is significantly lower cost impacts. And in some cases, indeed, relative to this year, which, again, has been something in and of itself of an energy shock, we do indeed find rate impacts on a forward-looking basis that don't exceed what we expect or what we've seen this year. And so from that point of view, indeed, relative to this year, no, we don't see that much of a rate shock. But again, we can ask the question as to whether that's a fair assessment. There are indeed, for each of these scenarios over time, a decrease in rates relative to the rate shock, and then an increase at some point as the total cost of all the resources that are built in take effect. That being said, none of these scenarios incorporate at all any of the incentives that have just recently been passed in the IRA. And so from that point of view, just to your point, the rate shock that we're seeing is it is not at all unreasonable to expect that IRA would significantly reduce the rate impact that even we're seeing. And so the hope is that maybe more than the hope, there is $370 billion of incentives that are aimed at trying to ensure that any state and utility that attempts to significantly reduce its carbon emissions will have significant financial measures being offered by the government and tax incentives being offered by the government that will mitigate that rate impact substantially more than anything we have modeled so far.
Great. Well,
Chair Mitchell, I hate to interrupt Mr. Rouse, but given the time, can I inquire whether or not the commission has questions before we run out of time in the day?
I have two more questions.
Thank you.
All right, well, Mr. Rouse, proceed.
Yeah.
With your cross-examination.
Except my computer went blank on me here. So I'm not going to go into all the details of the IRA because that's obviously beyond what we can talk about here. Would you say that let's talk just about the major impacts. Would you say that the production tax credit for nuclear is the biggest impact on Duke's rates?
I would argue that on a forward-looking basis, there are 3 other programs that may have more significant impacts. I would expect that the shift in tax normalization rules for storage and the ability to take the PTC in lieu of the ITC for solar are likely to potentially significantly reduce the cost of any utility-owned solar and storage assets. And given the significant prominence in virtually all the scenarios in the next in the next decade of solar and storage, those two measures will in particular reduce the cost, along with the possibility of transferability of tax credits, will reduce the cost of utility-owned solar and storage significantly. And the other piece I will mention, I know there's been quite a bit of discussion of transmission upgrades and the challenges of interconnection. There is a little-known program in the IRA called the Title 1706 loan program. And this loan program is an energy infrastructure reinvestment program. It is very broadly defined, but what it provides is very low-cost financing that in particular can be aimed at brownfields and transmission to allow repowering infrastructure upgrades at a much lower cost of capital than a private sector entity can afford. Now, of course, you wouldn't fund the whole thing with government financing, but it's $250 billion in lending authority at Treasuries plus 37.5 basis points that is available to significantly mitigate the cost and risks associated with reinvesting in brownfields and for reconductoring or performing other network upgrades that are intended to integrate clean energy. And I would argue that these provisions, particularly given some of the challenges and risks that I've been hearing through this proceeding, could be more impactful in many ways than some of the more obvious provisions. And I'd say the most obvious is just the extension of all of those tax credits. But these are really important to keep in mind.
Okay. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I don't have any other cross-examination indicated for the witness, but just checking in to make sure that is the case. You have cross-examination for the witness? Okay. Any redirect for the witness?
No, Chair Mitchell.
Okay, let me see if there are questions from commissioners. All right, I have just one for you. What I'm hearing you say is there are opportunities, some of which are sort of well-known and understood, like the tax credits. The production tax credits are investment tax credits. And then there are lesser known programs that are available that could offset or absorb some of the costs associated with the work that Duke is going to do going forward as a result of 951. Did I understand your testimony correctly?
That's absolutely right. There are a number of provisions that have been designed specifically to address some of the challenges that regulated utilities and their customers have faced in building clean energy. We've had tax incentives that have been put in place that largely didn't work for most of the utilities that own coal or fossil assets across the country, that disadvantage them effectively in taking advantage or discourage them from taking advantage of these tax credits. And some of those issues have been substantially fixed in the IRA. And there are programs like the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Act, lending programs that essentially provide financing to specifically address the opportunities for reinvestment in systems that have hosted significant fossil generation in the past and that should mitigate the cost of repurposing them for clean energy. And so,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, thank you for that. And I appreciate your testimony on the changes in the applicability or the usability of the tax credit by the utilities. And I am not a tax expert, so I won't ask you to explain that to me. I'm just going to accept your testimony as it is. In your work with your client in this docket and any discovery or discussions with the utilities that you have been a part of, is there anything, are you aware of anything or any information from the utilities that would lead you to believe they're not doing everything they can do to take advantage of these favorable tax treatment or the availability of federal funds to mitigate some of the upward pressure on costs?
So all I've seen, unfortunately, is just the late file testimony indicating an approach to incorporating IRA that the company took. What I do see there is reflected, the extension of some of the tax credits. I don't necessarily see, nor would I have necessarily expected to see, discussion of the tax normalization issue, their use potentially of the transferability necessarily discussed, nor of the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Act. So I think these are areas that were relatively obscure in the act. I would also point out, I don't yet see a deep discussion of the commercial incentive for electric vehicles and for electrification, fleet electrification. These are all incentives that I think could be very, very substantial in terms of its impact in North Carolina.
And Duke witnesses that have appeared on direct testimony have testified that there's still much to learn about, particularly the IRA. And I heard, and I'm hoping you had the opportunity to listen to them, but I heard that there were that they anticipate private letter rulings and other regulatory action coming out of the federal government before they'll have a full picture of the availability of credits or funds. Is that an unreasonable, do you think that's an unreasonable position for the company to have at this point in time, given what you know about the IRA?
I think the rulings are indeed coming. We expect that they will be happening in the next 6 months. I do think that the opportunities are large enough that there is significant risk to the company and to the state not to be anticipating what those rulings might be and to be moving quickly to take advantage of some of these provisions, not all of which are available indefinitely.
All right, I appreciate your testimony. I'm checking in to see if there are any questions on commissioners' questions. All right.
Yes, briefly. Dr. Varadarajan, following up on Chair Mitchell's questions about provisions in the IRA that haven't yet been considered by Duke and what you've seen so far, are there also, can you comment on the provisions related to home energy efficiency upgrades, heat pump hot water heaters, and that and the like?
Yeah, I would note that RMI has recently put out some analysis that it expects that there could be as much as on the order of 1 to 2 million new heat pumps that are incentivized by the tax credits that are now provided in the IRA in the near term. And similarly, there has been a reduction or an elimination of the cap for home energy retrofit tax credits and tax benefits across the board. There are also rebate programs that we anticipate will take longer to execute, but should make available substantial rebates, particularly for low-income customers, that could provide them up to $14,000 in upfront benefits to address home energy efficiency needs, including panel upgrades and other challenges to electrification. The net result of all of this should be potentially significantly greater opportunities for customer-driven energy efficiency retrofits, as well as ones that are assisted by a utility. And the combination of these are likely to start having an impact as soon as early next year with the tax credits, probably with more like somewhere between 12 and 24 months for the state and local driven rebates for low-income customers.
All right.
Thank you. No further questions.
All right. I'll take motions.
Thank you. Chair Mitchell, at this time we would move to admit exhibits UV1 and UV2 into the record.
All right. Hearing no objection, that motion will be allowed. You may step down. Thank you very much for your testimony today and your excuse. All right. With that, we are very close to the end of this day. I see Mr. Jimenez. Would you like to come up and make your motion, please, sir?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was informed by Commission staff that the Commission would entertain a renewed motion to enter Mr. Kaspari's report. I'd like to make that motion at this time. SACE et al. Move to enter at the appropriate time the report of Mr. J. Kaspari entitled Transmission Issues and Recommendations for Duke's Proposed Carbon Plan, consisting of 19 pages, including its attachment A and verification, filed in docket number E-100 sub 179 on July 15th, 2022, as Exhibit 2 to the joint comments of SACE et al. And NCSEA.
All right. Hearing no objection to the motion, it will be allowed.
Then Chair Mitchell, I should probably also make a similar motion for Exhibit 1 of those same comments, which was an RMI report analyzing the ratepayer impacts of Duke Energy's carbon plan proposal.
All right. Hearing no objection, your motion's allowed.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Snowden.
Chairman, CPSA called Brian Watts stand.
Mr. Snowden, I was under the impression that I had been informed that you were prepared to make a motion to waive the witness.
Well, yes, ma'am. I'll say this. So, Sigfer, who was the only party that had reserved cross time, they have waived cross. If the commission has questions for Mr. Watts, I'm happy to put him up and answer any commission questions. If the commission does not have questions for Mr. Watts, then I would ask to excuse him.
Okay, it's my understanding the commission does not have questions for the witness.
Okay, then I would ask that Mr. Watts be excused and that his pre-filed testimony and exhibits be moved into the record.
All right.
As well as his summary.
All right. The motion's allowed. The witness's testimony will be copied into the record as if delivered orally from the stand. Exhibits will be identified, marked for identification as they were when pre-filed, accepted in evidence, and the summary of his testimony will be copied into the record at the appropriate time as well. And the witness is excused.
Thank you, Chair Mitchell.
All right. All right. Before we adjourn, Mr. Dodge.
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. Good evening, just about, I think. Can't believe we're here almost at 5 o'clock. I'm Tim Dodge with North Carolina Electric Membership Corporation. On September 2nd, NCMC caused to be filed 2 sets of testimony in this docket, the testimony of Amadou Fall and Lee Ragsdale. And with regard to Mr. Fall, NCMC has conferred with all parties and have confirmed their willingness to waive the cross of Mr. Fall. And it's my understanding the commission does not have questions for Mr. Fall at this time. So therefore, we would request that his pre-filed testimony consisting of 13 pages with a correction filed on September 9th be copied in the record as if given orally from the stand, and that Mr. Fall be excused from appearing.
All right. Hearing no objection, your motion is allowed. Your witness is excused.
All right. And with regard to our second witness, Mr. Ragsdale, I similarly note that interveners have agreed to waive cross of Mr. Ragsdale, but it's my understanding the commission may have questions, so we anticipate having Mr. Ragsdale here to testify on Monday.
All right, and that's correct. All right, any additional matters for my consideration before we adjourn? All right, not hearing any, so we will be back on the record at 11 o'clock on Monday. We will begin the day with, in accordance to what I think is the most recent witness list, Mr. Fitch. Is that correct?
Mr. Fitch does have a conflict at the end of the day on Monday, which we could work around. So if it's the commission's preference, just continue in the order, we can make that work.
Well, I'm just going off, had the parties agreed on a different order? I'm going off the order that's in front of me.
It's been such a fluid situation that we haven't yet had a chance to confer about taking Mr. Fitch in different order. So we can just make him, we'll get him here at 11 a.m. on Monday.
Okay. All right. Anything else before we go off the record? All right. With that, we'll be off the record. Thank you very much.